Hey guys, how are you all? Welcome back to my channel. Today we will see what if Naruto creates his own teleportation jutsu. If you enjoy, then please like, share and do comments. The day was passing fairly slowing for once. Hokage Hiruzen Sarutobi thought idly, reviewing the sheet of paper held in his left hand as his right hovered with a pen nearby to sign his affirmation. So far Naruto had been remarkably quiet, and the report given to him on the boy's daily activities were a cause for some worry. A day with Naruto lost in thought is a night of mischief just waiting to unfold. Those were the words he had murmured at the time he had read the scroll, and indeed they came unbidden to his mind again as he went over the same paragraph for the third time in so many minutes. Finally catching on to what he was doing, Hiruzen set the unsigned sheet and pen back down atop the rest and stretched, feeling every bit his age for the moment. The Uchiha clan massacre still unsettled him deeply, the regrets he carried over the incident weighing in on him more heavily than any other event in his time of service to the village since the Kyuubi's attack 8 years before. So many disasters in so short a period, less than a decade apart. Between those thoughts and his usual duties, in addition to trying to keep the villagers in line against Naruto and the boy's own rarely harmless pranks against them in turn, looking over the stack of paperwork he had to handle was quickly sliding out of his attention span. Perhaps a few words may deter him from whatever it is on his mind, and a few more ought to relieve my own from that particular distraction, he mused aloud. As was to be expected, Naruto was found at his seemingly favorite place, the ramen stand. Unexpectedly he was not sitting nor eating, but rather standing a short distance off and staring blankly ahead. As Hiruzen approached he cleared his throat to try and alert the child, but no reaction occurred. Good luck with that, Hokage-sama. He's been standing there for the better part of an hour now. If his chest wasn't rising and falling, I'd say he was dead. Tucci called out in a quiet, concerned tone from behind the bar. Hiruzen frowned even as he gave a brisk nod of his head toward the shop owner, checking the nearby shadows. The handful of Enbu assigned to keep Naruto out of trouble met his gaze from behind cold porcelain, succinct, affirmative nods passing between them all. He placed a hand to Naruto's right shoulder as he came around and knelt to the ground slowly, looking into the distant but not glazed-over effect in the boy's eyes, and silently performed a variance of the technique that young Yamashiro-kun had picked up not long ago for mind reading. What he felt was a strong presence he was unaccustomed to when inspecting Naruto's mind for undue influence, one that went beyond the usual vague sense of rage he associated with the Biju dwelling somewhere deep within, and more akin to a sense of inherent strength. Before he could inquire any further, Naruto blinked several times in rapid succession and looked up at him. "Ah, old man Hokage," he greeted somewhat slowly. Hiruzen did not move or release his grip on the boy's shoulders at the words, instead examining the child's eyes further. "Naruto, is there anything you'd like to tell me? Any adverse reactions you have been feeling lately?" he inquired softly. Naruto didn't seem to notice the intensity of the elder shinobi's expression just yet, but after a moment he did glance around at their surroundings and then smiled widely as if in remembrance. "Could it wait till after a few bowls of ramen?" he asked in turn. That seemed to satisfy the Sandaime for the moment, and he again nodded his head. "Very well," he agreed vocally, letting go and rising to his feet quickly. Naruto grinned and launched himself at the nearest seat, placing his hands onto the table amicably. Several empty bowls of ramen noodles and the better part of 20 minutes later and the duo were within the Hokage's office. "I believe you had something to say?" Hiruzen reminded him after they were each sitting across from one another. "Ah, yeah, about that." The boy trailed off uncertainly. His mind was racing through how best to explain what he had to explain, but seeing the third alive and well again was putting him off of jumping straight into the thick of things. "Yes?" Quote. Hiruzen pressed after several moments of silence. Naruto grimaced. "There's no easy way around this, he has to know to make the right preparations. You know the Kyuubi attack 8 years ago? The one that required Dad to sacrifice himself in order to seal the fox inside of me?" he asked awkwardly. Hiruzen looked more than a little surprised at the mentioning of Minato as Dad, and silently made a note to find out who it was that had revealed that particular set of state secrets to Naruto. But rather than interrupt wherever this was going and possibly scare the boy off of his point just yet, the Hokage merely nodded his head. "Well, it wasn't wholly the fox's fault. I mean, it probably hurt a lot of people and I know it killed some of them, and nearly destroyed Konoha, which I'm sure it was just as happy to do after so long cooped up inside of mom, but it was kind of directed to the task. Naruto explained in a rush. Hiruzen cocked an eyebrow at him, once more unsettled at the abrupt revelation. And you know of this, not to mention are able to confirm it, how? Naruto met his gaze evenly and answered firmly, I kind of met the guy at fault, among other things. Madara Uchiha. At that name Hiruzen grew still and his eyes became genuinely cold, recalling quite clearly the second-hand information of that night, and when he spoke his lips hardly moved. When? He demanded without any of his usual warmth to it, knowing for a fact that there was little to no chance that man could still be alive, and running through the ways the child before him could have come to associate Madara to the Kyuubi incident. The list was fairly short. Either one of the few older Jonin present for that battle had spoken out against his orders, which would cover why Naruto would refer to the fourth as his father and Kushina as his mother, or the seals preventing the Kyuubi from accessing Naruto's mind were beginning to crumble. Glancing around them and feeling for any other familiar chakra sources nearby, Naruto leaned in closer. Can I get your word that you won't repeat any of this to Danzo or the rest of the council? He asked evasively, a sudden look of wariness present in his blue gaze. Hiruzen did not answer him for a long moment, but at length he gave his response. That will depend on where you are going with this. His voice had not changed. Naruto sighed. I'm going to meet him in about 8 more years, as history goes, he stated evenly. Seeing the Hokage's unamused look he hurried forward quickly. To make a long story short, he's still out there as a part of the Akatsuki, trying to gather up the rest of the Jinchuriki and their Biju to merge back into a single 10-tailed beast again. He explained in a rush, hoping to convince the man that had been like a grandfather to him for so long now. Silence filled the large room after that as Hiruzen processed what Naruto was saying. The boy seemed genuinely confident in what he spoke, but then again he always stood by what he said, true or no. Distinct words rang familiar as others made no sense, and the brief thought of a chakra beast more potent than the 9-tailed fox sent a dread chill across his spine for just an instant. It seemed much more likely that what he said would align to the second possibility, that of the seals eroding, however. I am disheartened that you would dishonor the sacrifice of the fourth Hokage in such a manner. When did the Kyuubi manage to convince you to let it have this much control, Naruto? He asked. Naruto grimaced again. It didn't, he stated. It's still locked up with Dad's seal in place inside of that stupid sewer, growling angrily at me. Please do not lie to me. I've seen how much different you are within. Hiruzen countered. Naruto's look changed to puzzlement. You did? He asked in surprise. As I have for several years now, to ensure you do not succumb to the Kyuubi's control or tainted chakra. It would appear that I should have been more vigilant in that manner. Hiruzen answered, almost too softly to hear, and almost to himself more so than the boy before him. A sick feeling grew in the pit of his stomach as Naruto heard those words. You've been spying on me? He questioned in disbelief. The Sandaime realized how his words could be viewed in such a context and in turn grimaced, raising one hand in a calming motion. Not in the way that you think. I have only gone so far as to verify the Kyuubi remained at length from your conscious mind. Naruto stood up. Unbelievable. You know what? I'll show you proof that I'm still me in telling the truth. Naruto stated in a pained tone, stepping back from the Hokage and performing the basic hand seals of the shadow clone technique. Hiruzen acted quickly to counteract whatever Naruto was about to perform, no doubt a trick of the Kyuubi. He thought as he rose in an instant and flung himself over the desk. And then his hands caught Naruto's and pressed the boy against the wall. Only to have the body explode into smoke before him. What? The elder shinobi asked as if disbelieving his eyes. A short laugh caught his attention from behind the desk. Turning about he saw a trio of Narutos sitting smugly in his chair or hanging off the edges. This, as you well know, is the Shadow Clone Jutsu. A forbidden technique currently wrapped up in a large scroll somewhere in here. Seeing as you have it under a fair guard and you would have caught me long before I successfully read it, will you finally listen to what I have to say? Naruto asked him. Hiruzen stared at them in further disbelief, for it was true that the technique was as he said. A moment later and a flicker of motion as the Sandaime turned completely serious saw 3 kunai sailing at them at a far more deadly pace. Two of the knives cut through the clones on the left and right armrests before they could react and left them vanished into puffs of smoke, while the third yelped and only just ducked the third such weapon. Its tainted edge sliced into one cheek as it was intended. "Ow!" Naruto complained, holding a hand to the leaking wound and scowling at the old man. "What was that for?" he demanded. Hiruzen walked forward slowly and leaned over his desk, drumming the fingers along its surface quickly in agitation. "You should feel the sedative poison leaking through your bloodstream any moment now. I am sorry, Naruto, but whatever it is that has happened to you of late, I cannot allow it to continue. Whatever lies the Kyuubi has told in order to establish a hold in your chakra, whatever it has managed to teach you," he gestured to the empty air where the clones had previously sat, "must be undone." He finished on a hard note. Naruto shuddered without answering, having never heard or felt the intensity of the Hokage's words now as he had before, or been harmed directly by his hand like this. He could counteract the poison if he used some of the fox's chakra, but that would only convince the Sandame of the danger he represented at the moment. Which meant, unfortunately for him, that he would have to gut it out and try to get his point across again before it worked through his body. He simply couldn't do what he had planned since waking up this morning almost a decade younger without the elder shinobi's help, and having his future knowledge potentially purged scared him greatly. Breathing in sharply through his mouth as the unfortunately swift-moving poison rushed through his veins, Naruto stubbornly sat up and stared into Hiruzen's eyes. "Here, dig around until you get the answers you need. I'm not going to give up." His words were cut off as he coughed suddenly. Looking back up at the Hokage, he gripped the edges of the chair tightly and settled his head against the soft material, looking straight into the old man's eyes. Hiruzen stared at him for another long moment before reaching a hand forward and placing it directly to the boy's head, choosing to utilize the Yamanaka family's preferred technique in place of Yamashiro-kun's derivative on it, and slid into Naruto's mind. It was not a pleasant ninjutsu to perform even at his age. Meeting Sasuke on the team for the first time, actually sitting down and speaking for more than a simple sparring lesson, and immediately disliking him. Fighting with the other boy in the Chunin exams, and the Forest of Death. Struggling against Gaara as the other Jinchuriki transformed piece by piece into a monster. Learning of Orochimaru's attack and the loss of Sandame. Jiraiya teaching him the methods of the Rasengan, using base materials easily bought. Spinning, rotating, inverting the simple objects at last. Creating his first Rasengan successfully in battle. Meeting with Tsunade and winning their loose bet over the technique. Utilizing the Rasen Shuriken in battle. Arriving at a demolished landscape, and learning it was Konoha. Entering Sage mode and protecting the Godem from Pain's attack. Falling to the Kyuubi's dominion at the loss of Hinata. Speaking with his father at last. Destroying the last of Pain's assumed bodies and hunting down his true self. Tearing himself from Naruto's memories, if indeed they were such, Hiruzen leaned back and gripped the edges of his desk tightly to keep himself upright. The sheer flood of emotions. He thought, eyes looking over the small child before him. Naruto was shivering as he resisted the urge to throw up and collapse to the ground, eyes flickering between half-lidded and wide open and mouth set in a frown even as he panted. "Does that convince you, old man? Hokage?" Naruto questioned, shuddering again and slamming his mouth shut, breathing rapidly through his nose to keep the bile back as his lunch disagreed with the poison. Hiruzen did not know how to react. He had seen memories before, had experienced them when needed, and the only difference was how firmly attached Naruto was and how deeply involved his emotions were linked to them, compared to the almost detachment others held for the majority of their memories. Quickly diving out of the chair and out of sight of the Hokage, Hiruzen was spared the sight of those ramen noodles coming back and earning revenge after all these years on Naruto's unending hunger as he at last succumbed toward the inevitable rumbling in his belly. After a few moments Hiruzen pulled out a small vial of antidote from his pockets and walked around, kneeling by the shuddering child and placing a reassuring hand to his back as he tried to ignore the smell emanating up at him. He didn't notice how Naruto managed a faint upturning of his lips in victory, which faded again as he finished up with his afternoon meal and sagged toward another patch of the floor almost unconsciously. Leaning Naruto back in the lull between motions, Hiruzen uncorked and pressed the small vial to the child's mouth, and Naruto didn't hesitate to swallow the bland liquid. The sedative trying to drag him down gradually lightened, and he inhaled slowly and deeply and clamped his lips shut to keep it down, focusing on controlling his stomach after a few seconds to keep any more from coming up. In a couple of minutes he felt weak but otherwise mostly recovered, and Naruto stood up tiredly. "Sorry about your floor, Hokage-sama," he stated sincerely, looking embarrassed at the mess. Hiruzen led them both away from it and toward an open window. "Do not worry yourself over it," he responded softly, still contemplating just what to do. After several seconds of silence the boy spoke up, "If you saw the same things I did, then does that convince you?" Naruto asked softly. "I do not know what I believe, Naruto." Hiruzen responded evenly and heard the other suppress a sigh. "You know there are space-time techniques, right?" he asked. Hiruzen nodded his head without answering. Naruto glanced at his reaction and continued. "Madara uses one to teleport himself or anyone else wherever he needs with just his Sharingan, and Kakashi-sensei uses his Sharingan to manipulate dimensions for a similar result." He paused to gauge the reaction again. Hiruzen remained silent, not showing an outward expression but inside growing further unsettled. "I kind of got caught in between them when I was in Sage mode about 8.5 years from now," Naruto continued. "The natural energies got entangled with the space-time energy of the jutsu and, well, as far as we can tell, I got blasted back in time. But I don't know if this is the same dimension as the one I'm supposed to be in." Naruto finished, staring at Hiruzen and almost demanding that the old Hokage acknowledge him. Further silence went out for another minute until Hiruzen sighed. "Tell me everything you know, Naruto. Everything you can that I haven't already told you about at your age but plan to in the years ahead," he answered him. Naruto grimaced. Come on, you didn't share a whole lot before the Chunin exams. Can't I just say where Arrow Sennin is or something at this time frame and you send out a shinobi team to verify?" he complained, finding it hard to believe after everything else. Hiruzen shook his head. "Not quite the same," he answered, though inwardly he agreed that it could be a useful way of truly solidifying what he was being told. Naruto huffed in indignation and sat down on the floor, sighing. "This is gonna take a while. Let me consult myself a few times to make sure I've got it all set," he stated, and as before with the proper motions he summoned 3 more duplicates. Hiruzen frowned but stepped back as the foursome pressed heads together and whispered among themselves for several minutes. After hearing his words repeated back at himself yet again, or near enough that he had good reason to believe them, Hiruzen nodded his head with a grim expression on his face. The 4 Narutos let out a collective sigh of relief before high-fiving one another with grins stretching their faces. A few more moments passed before they quieted down and the duplicates dissipated into smoke once more, leaving the original sitting on the floor and looking up at the Hokage eagerly, having recovered some of his strength by that point. "You must understand, Naruto, that what you have told me is unsettling. The knowledge you hold of the future is a burden you should not pass on to others without strict consideration," Hiruzen told him in a tired tone, closing his eyes in thought. Naruto nodded his head. "Of course. I didn't even want to tell you, but I kinda need your help for most of what I want to alter," he responded seriously. The older shinobi frowned at him without opening his eyes. "If you change one thing then you are liable to change many more as an unintended result. We must discuss the merits and risks of whatever it is you have in mind before even beginning to implement the first alteration," he responded in the same tone. Come on, old man Hokage. How much could shift out of place by making a few friends earlier?" Naruto asked him with a frown. Hiruzen turned toward the Jinchuriki and finally opened his eyes with an raised eyebrow at the boy. "No, this teenager, in mind and maturity if nothing else," he silently corrected, and said, "Who did you have in mind?" "I sensed something about the youngest Uchiha during your memories with Jiraiya-san, and a similar if different result from the red-haired child." "Oh, well, Sasuke sooner or later. Probably sooner to try and keep him from becoming too introverted and focused on killing Itachi and getting revenge above all else," Naruto answered. "And Gaara definitely ranks up there. Even now he's probably fending off an assassination attempt in his home village. If I can befriend him as a child it might help contain how murderous he'd become later." Hiruzen shook his head slowly in sorrow at hearing such a situation awaited each boy in the times ahead. "Is that all?" he questioned. Naruto shook his own head. "No. Friend-wise probably, but there's a lot of other stuff to get a handle on before it's too late, old man Hokage." It might be possible to wrangle up Yakushi Kabuto and get a foothold into Orochimaru's network for starters. He responded, then with a nod of the head he added, maybe we could try and do something about a megacure before Nagato becomes completely lost inside of his grief and pain persona. I do not want to fight his six paths or the Rinnegan again. He could have helped out in so many ways if he had lived, and I know he has it in him to perform good again. While Jinchuriki and Hokage spoke nearby, an unwelcome pair of ears listened in from below. The wood beneath the sash of the window captured every word and detail intimately, as it had been so since Tenzo was enfolded into the Anbu, and the hidden root immediately thereafter, 3 years prior. In part, the Mokuton endowed nin's nature was to be sure that the Hokage would always have a ready guard prepared to react and as a warning in place should an attempt to kidnap or even kill him occur, or a henge user try to replace him at some point in order to deceive Konoha and the council. But in truth, his primary reason for the deception was to record down anything that might help Root secure the future of Konoha. Any mission that might be seen as too awkward to be carried out upon the Hokage's orders, either in public or in private, whether the Sandaime chose to present the details to Danzo-sama or not, would be dealt with at the discretion of the hidden Root in secret, and often at certain lengths and a healthy time dilation to be sure the Hokage or those who had brought the information forth in the first place would never grow suspicious as their goals were fulfilled and enemies neutralized. The information that Tenzo overheard that afternoon both alarmed him and, he was certain, would need to be relayed to the elder figure at the earliest opportunity. Enough, enough. Yes, Naruto, your ambitions are fair and just. But we cannot just set about altering every little thing that you would like to see done. Hiruzen argued after hearing the rest of Naruto's plans for the weeks ahead. His eyes narrowed to thin slits and his frown sharpened unconsciously. Why not? He questioned in annoyance. To begin with, you yourself said this may not even be the same dimension you were born in, and though much of what you declared aligns with what I would likely had done, I can affirm that there are discrepancies here and there that point to the odds of even more differences in this world. We cannot guarantee that events have fully transpired the same or will stay along similar routes if you start poking at them. Hiruzen answered in slowly rising annoyance as well, if disappointment. Naruto hmphed to himself in frustration and pushed up to his feet, feeling uncharitably irritated. This was not going the way he had thought, foolishly hoped, even, that it would have. Which was why he had not initially wanted to alert the Sandaime to his presence. The desire to speak with the old man, well and alive again, had been too strong to ignore, however, and now it seemed that he should have tried harder to do just that anyway. Fine, have it your way, but I'm not just going to sit here on my haunches all day long and wait around for the Akatsuki to get a move on picking us all off at their leisure. With that said, he pushed to his feet and headed for the open window's ledge. Where are you going? The Hokage demanded as he strode forward as well, again preparing to stop Naruto if need be. Training. Naruto snapped over one shoulder as he rolled out the window toward the ground below. He hit with a low thud and rolled through it, popping back to his feet with a slight slouch of disorientation from the size difference between his older body and the younger one. Just one of the things he would need to adjust to before he started gallivanting out of the village. After a moment Naruto shook his head to clear it, then began jogging quickly off toward the old training grounds he had used for so long as a child the first time around. The Hokage watched him go with a feeling of unease replacing his anger. You really could have handled that better, Hiruzen, he thought slowly, turning in the direction of the door as someone stepped in without knocking. Stupid old man, thunk. Stupid Madara Uchiha, thunk. Stupid me, thunk. With every annoyed thought he threw an old and shoddily cast kunai toward the mark on the tree down range about 30 feet, nearly half an hour after departing the Hokage tower. The slightly battered tools strayed off the path he was aiming for every time, but all he cared about at the moment was that they were at least staying in the crudely drawn chalk circle he had put there who knows how long ago. Another few throws later and he had to go and fetch them again. A hastily summoned shadow clone moped as it leisurely walked forward and tore the objects free with more force than needed, leaving rents in the surface of the wood deeper than the knives had originally penetrated. Come on, haven't got all day, Naruto grumbled. His duplicate heard from across the distance and made a face, responding in distaste, yeah, we kinda do. Well, what are we going to do about it? Naruto shot back. His shadow clone frowned and thought, stopping where he was. Naruto eyeballed himself standing there, considering. Don't bother. Kyuubi and I already went over the facts, mostly growls and threats on the fox's part, and Old Man Hokage's the only one we can confide in for the moment. He stated. A low whistling sound pierced the air as a proper kunai thrown with practiced ease and surety sunk into his duplicate's forehead and carried on into the tree behind, wedging itself deep enough for the tip to emerge from the back and leave a narrow fissure splintering off from the point of contact. Naruto spun around to see a tall nen wearing a dog or fox-faced plate in the usual black and gray clothing of an ANBU, worn armor scarred from odd scratches, striding easily around the underbrush some distance away. Huh? He uttered in surprise. Normally the Anbu tasked to keeping watch on him avoided such a blatant approach, and to see one just boldly step out of the shadows put him slightly on guard after the better part of a day in thought. Mizuki's betrayal was suddenly bright and fresh in his mind. SSHH, the voice that emerged from beneath the mask was slightly hollow due to the porcelain, but it was one that after a few moments thought he recognized, drawing a curious frown across his face. Naruto relaxed his guard momentarily as he stared at who he suspected to be Yamato beneath the mask. Did the Hokage change his mind, after all? He wondered. I doubt a Jonin would just show themselves so easily otherwise, and perhaps he chose one I would trust, outside of Kakashi-sensei. Still, he hesitantly asked, Yamato Taicho? The other shinobi did not show any signs of recognizing that name. He simply carried onward and only slowed after the distance had been cut down to several feet of open space. Naruto watched him uncertainly, turning and walking around to observe the boy, the faceplate tilted to the side as if in silent curiosity, and after doing 2 full rounds the presumed man stopped slightly behind the Jinchuriki's back. That same flicker of uncertainty held for an instant, just one overly long moment, before he felt it strengthen immediately into unease, and that further into doubt. This isn't right. Shun shining away and turning around to face the Anbu. His eyes honed in on the flashing hand seals being performed in that time and was instantly put on guard again. I don't know if you are who I think you are, he began, molding chakra and raising a handful of tentative clones with the practically ancient hand seals for them. And then the world seemed to shudder beneath all of their feet, and whether he was on guard or not no longer mattered. The ANBU's own final hand seal had come and gone during his short-lived warning, and the chakra already sent into the field only minutes ago, shortly before emerging, was manifested into Earth release, Earth flow divide. A yawning fissure divided the land from underneath Naruto and his clones before they could even react, delivering the lot of them into the underlying wood release. 4-pillar prison technique. Naruto's eyes widened as he fell into the open cage and was instantly crushed against the minuscule bars at the front of it. Tendrils and branches surged forward and upward to drive his body into an awkwardly arched position, splaying his fingers apart to prevent any further hand seals, and nearly smothering him as his chest was compressed. He gagged on the branch that spread into his mouth and trapped his upper and lower jaw apart, shoving his tongue toward the back of his throat to keep him from crying out. His clones were crushed into smoke again, and those cages melded into his own, forming a dozen handholds all around it. NGGH. The panicked sound barely escaped from his mouth. He tried reaching for the Kyuubi's chakra, but a dense barrier seemed to have arisen between he and the tailed beast, and Naruto was suddenly, absolutely certain, that the man ahead of him was indeed Yamato. No one else was capable of such Mokuton creations, or suppressing a Biju. Breath, he thought desperately, struggling to inhale enough air through his nostrils. He could barely keep his thoughts from spiraling out of control, but it came to him that the Hokage would not have sent Yamato to bind him in such a manner. His fears bespoke of another man that might very well seek out a future sent Jinchuriki, Danzo himself. He couldn't have, it shouldn't be possible, he began to hyperventilate. The Anbu rose from his momentarily kneeling posture and strode forward calmly. Unlike Naruto, his mind was clear and focused on his duties to the village, and the hidden route. If the Hokage would not mind the information from the future, even if partially inaccurate, then it would be utilized as such information had been for years now, to benefit Konoha from out of the shadows. Lifting the light yet firm prison and its query into the air and then settling it over the shoulders, Yamato kicked off from the dirt a short distance before turning back and closing the divided land once more. With that done, he rushed back into the forest around them. If his attention had not been focused singularly upon Naruto and covering his own tracks, however, he may well have taken note of the other boy within the area, who was only just approaching that particular training field when the Anbu had struck. The youngest Uchiha stared after them for a very long time. The Hokage looked at the unexpected and, more so, bold intruder to his office. "Kakashi-san? What can I do for you at this moment?" he questioned mildly. Hikate Kakashi sniffed at the air in curiosity before blanching. "What died in here?" The Jonin wondered aloud, momentarily distracted from answering. Hiruzen let out a grim laugh. "A slight accident with Naruto. I'll have it dealt with later. Come over here if you wish to discuss something. The smell is kept at bay through the wind drifting inward," he responded. Kakashi nodded his head and stepped forward quickly. "I wish to take over the Uchiha survivors' education and well-being," he stated firmly in answer to the Sandame's question. Hiruzen quickly riffled through any action the copy ninja had displayed over the last few weeks that might have forewarned of this action, and then further back still. Unfortunately, he couldn't recognize a single instance leading up to this moment. "What brought this about?" he asked, giving Kakashi his full attention. "As the sole other Konohan shinobi capable of the Sharingan, to begin with, I can teach him to bring it out sooner and gain dominance of the power in a safe manner." "Relatively speaking," he answered. "Relatively speaking," Hiruzen quoted dryly, and Kakashi nodded his head. "Of course. He is a ninja to be, after all, and there will be danger involved for him, but hardly as much as he would have to endure on his own. And I can guide him and train him in preparation for the difficulties laying ahead of him as the last Uchiha," the copy ninja responded. "He remains in just as much danger as the Hyuga heiress of being kidnapped by another village, and frankly, I'm amazed no one has dared to try, not even Kumo." When the Hokage made no motion to speak, he added, "But aside from that, I suspect that without a proper force in his life to guide him and teach him, the chances of him safely making it to even Chunin level falls with every passing month." Hiruzen remained silent for such a length of time after that Kakashi began to wonder if the Hokage had taken ill, but at last he sighed. "Very well. If you will agree, you may take Uchiha Sasuke on as your unofficial pupil," he stated wearily. "I could easily wait." "What?" Kakashi began and paused in mid-protest. "You're agreeing?" he asked, not quite able to accept that things had been accomplished so easily. Hiruzen gave him a low scowl. "Yes, you have my permission to take the last Uchiha under your wing, Hitaki," he answered shortly. Kakashi frowned beneath his mask. "I didn't expect it to be that easy after such a length of silence," he responded honestly. Hiruzen's face didn't change. "Drudge up the required paperwork after you have his agreement and I'll sign the waiver," the Hokage warned in an ominous tone that unsettled the Jonin. "You will be responsible for Sasuke Uchiha's survival from that point forward." "Yes, Hokage-sama," he answered respectfully at last. Turning and retreating back through the door, he began working his way toward the Uchiha compound as a starting point to search out the child. Hiruzen grimaced once the Jonin was gone. "Look at what you've already begun in the wake of your arrival, Naruto. The only reason I even agreed to this is to try and maintain what few ties to Konoha that I can for the boy." He exhaled warily, not liking what was to come for the youngest of the three remaining Uchiha line at all if history stayed true to its path. Better to interfere now and hope to guide the sails of change reluctantly rather than not at all. "Look what you've managed to wrap us up into now, boy." A vicious snarl echoed across the walls of the sewer. Naruto grimaced at the fox. How was I supposed to know he'd do that? Yamato never showed any signs of this in the future, even if he did threaten to use force as an instrument of training. He responded defensively. "Really?" The Kyuubi demanded in a tone that if it weren't the fox, Naruto might have taken as sarcasm rather than a biting rhetoric. "I thought you were supposed to be smarter after 8 years, but of course not. Your attention has wavered ever since the moment you left that office." It growled at him. Naruto growled right back at it. "I can get us out of this if you'd let me return to my body." The Kyuubi's eyes flared and the full brunt of his killing intent stabbed at Naruto sharply. "Do not presume to argue with me, child. You think I desire to speak with you? The damage you were invoking in an effort to break free would have destroyed us if I allowed it to go onward." The fox roared. Naruto picked himself up off the floor about 5 seconds after being blown over by the rush of chakra-suffused wind, grimy water dripping off of his hair and clothing. "Do not fight the cage." Have you forgotten the control over my fellow Biju that the line of Senju possesses? That cursed blood and nature is imbued within our captor, and you will not escape as you are, so invoke your precious sage mode if you want a way to weaken the bindings and slip free. The Kyuubi growled at him. Naruto stared at it almost blankly for several seconds before smacking himself in the forehead for not thinking of that sooner. But he noticed a flaw in that plan. He's gonna freak out and really draw out the suppression techniques if I do that, he argued. Kyuubi's tails flicked back and forth in rapid agitation before he settled down onto his front paws again, looking away from Naruto. Do as you will, if you do not kill us first, it stated, and with that dismissal Naruto found his form drifting back and away from the cage of steel and rising toward consciousness again, to return to his own cage of wood. Naruto blinked several times as he returned to consciousness, tears gathering in the corners of his eyes from the wind streaming into them. His heart still thumped quickly in his chest, but the near panic that had consumed him earlier on was strangely calmer after his meeting with the Kyuubi. Perhaps knowing that he had a means of breaking free again was the difference. The cage shook and jostled around upon Yamato's shoulders as the older shinobi carted him through the dense foliage. Far too much vibration to try and grasp the stillness required of nature chakra. I only need a few moments, he thought, forcefully exhaling and then inhaling slowly only to repeat the breathing exercise. It took more effort of will to simply slow his lungs down than he would have liked, and most of his body was beginning to protest against the unnatural shape he was contorted into now that he was aware enough to acknowledge the pain. He blinked again and closed his eyes. It was just too blurry for him to make out any kind of viable guess for where they were, or where they might be going. He couldn't even judge the shadows on the ground thanks to the current cloud cover blotting out the sun at the moment, leaving their direction as much a mystery as the rest. With nothing to do but wait for the opportunity, Naruto continued to work on his breathing and tried to ease the aches developing everywhere, and only then did he begin to think on what would happen when he could finally reach out and enter Sage mode, and how to handle a confrontation with Danzo Shimura when he did. There you are, Kakashi stated as he finally entered the training ground clearing, mildly put out that it had taken so long to find his potential charge. Sasuke was still standing in place with a contemplative expression on his dark features, and he turned toward the elder shinobi but said nothing as he was approached. Unlike the orange-clad idiot he had seen wrapped up and carried away earlier, he kept his guard up and reached for one of the kunai at his back cautiously. Kakashi noticed the reaction and slowed, raising his hands in a showing of peace. Calm down, he said softly. Sasuke eyeballed him and took a step back, sliding into a fighting stance he had learned before from his brought that man, he corrected himself, who had killed his entire family. Kakashi did not like how this was starting off. Relax, Uchiha, I'm not here to fight you, he said. Sasuke tensed at his last name and gripped the kunai tighter, mistrust clear in his eyes. The Jonin sighed and slowly drew back the Hite-8 over his left eye, opening it up and displaying the red energy and trio of black tomo therein. Sasuke let out a shout at seeing the Sharingan again so soon after the destruction of his entire family, and the arm holding the kunai began to tremble. He wanted to turn and look away with every passing moment, but a paralyzed numbness swept through his body as if trapped. Move. He struggled to pull his thoughts together as the events of that night half a year ago flooded the forefront of his mind. So much blood, his parents slumped over beside the table with glassy black eyes, and his brother calmly stepping forward to finish the job. Sasuke's whole body shook, staring up at the man across from him and seeing only those swirling red eyes. Kakashi felt even more mystified than before over this reaction to what he had thought might be a comforting sight. What exactly am I doing wrong here? He silently asked, frowning when the boy's grip slackened from his shaking. That kunai was in imminent danger of dropping and digging into his toes. Something is definitely amiss. Making up his mind and striding forward, Kakashi watched as the motion seemed to stir the last Uchiha's body into action. Desperation suffused the angles of Sasuke's face, and with only a foot of distance separating them the boy abruptly lurched. His fingers clenched down and then the kunai was thrown with as much force and accuracy as he could, and even as his arm was descending he pivoted on one foot and turned to race off in the other direction. Kakashi caught the object in mid-motion with one hand and dashed forward, slipping past and then turning to catch the child by the shoulders with his other arm, and dropping down to one knee all in the process of just seconds. "What troubles you so?" he questioned in a quiet, calm tone. Sasuke trembled violently in his grip and managed a low snarl, glaring at the Sharingan with a look of mingled hatred and burning terror for what it had last brought upon him. "I've made a mistake. This isn't helping," the older shinobi realized at last. Reaching up with one hand to cover Obito's eye with his forehead protector again, Kakashi stared down at Sasuke and repeated his question. Sasuke went silent, hands balled up into fists. Lowering his head with a sigh, Kakashi released the boy and stood up. "I know you miss your family dearly, and I had hoped to raise you and train you in lieu of your father and brother to do it," he stated, hoping that clarifying why he was there might finally get them on the same ground. He did catch how Sasuke made a noise of objection at the end of that statement, and yet his feet remained firmly planted where he stood, not moving an inch. "If you change your mind and decide to talk to me, I'll be waiting at the edge of the Uchiha compound." Stepping around him, Kakashi made the hand seal for the body flicker technique and paused in mid-motion as the child murmured something beneath his breath. Sasuke repeated himself just barely louder. "I can't hear you." The Jonin lied, having clearly heard the words the first time. He waited for the boy to turn and face him, and Sasuke finally did so and said in a loud and angry tone, "Why? Why would you want to?" Kakashi tilted his head to the side. "Do I need a reason to help?" he asked. Sasuke managed a fairly accurate glare at him. "Okay, yes," he amended a moment later before growing silent for several seconds, debating the reasoning over one more time in his own mind before giving it to the boy. "One of your uncles, Obito Uchiha, was one of my teammates a long time ago. We didn't often get along until his final mission. He sacrificed himself to save both my life and our other teammate, and even gave up his newly awoken Sharingan for me at the end. I've never had the chance to repay his sacrifice, and I never will now that his clan, your clan, is gone. Not unless I help you." His voice grew somewhat faint as he visualized that day and the events therein. "You're just using me to make your guilt go away," Sasuke stated in a quiet but no less angry tone. Kakashi startled him by laughing grimly. "In a way I am, yes," he conceded, and before the child could say anything he continued in a kinder tone, "But, I genuinely want to see you live a long life, Sasuke. I want you to rebuild your clan when you've grown old enough for that responsibility, and I want you to be capable of defending yourself, and, if need be, killing anyone that tries to kill you first," he said firmly. Sasuke pondered that. He wanted to make his broth that man pay dearly for destroying his family, and to do that he would need a lot of time and training to grow strong enough. He had always been so far behind, never reaching the same heights at the same ages as the other shinobi. "I'll do it," he said quietly. "You will?" Kakashi asked. Sasuke nodded his head reluctantly, and Kakashi smiled sadly beneath the mask overlapping his lower face. "Then let's gather up the paperwork and go visit the Hokage," he stated. The child nodded his head before saying, "Just don't carry me away in a cage like that foxface did the idiot." Kakashi stared at him blankly. "What?" he asked. Sasuke repeated himself. "Cage? Foxface? Do you mean an Anbu member?" the Jonin questioned. Sasuke nodded his head. "An Anbu dragged off someone you consider an idiot. Who else would run around in orange, shouting, 'Believe it,' all the time?" Sasuke questioned in annoyance. It took a moment for that to click into place. What reason does an Anbu member have to cart off Naruto-kun in a cage of all things? He thought, grimacing. "Right, we'll have to postpone the paperwork. Hop on." Leaning over and offering his shoulder to the child, he waited for Sasuke to climb up. The boy made a face at being toted around like a 5-year-old and stated that firmly. "Okay then, express it is." Turning and scooping Sasuke up into his arms, Kakashi gave him only a moment to grip on tightly, even as he protested before shining toward the Hokage's office. The wind died down as the lurching of the cage slowed, and Naruto's eyes flashed open in an instant, blinking rapidly to clear his gaze and take in the darkness of the cavern they had just entered. The wide and barren hall was only faintly illuminated by a handful of lights bracketed to the walls, and a head branched outward into 3 directions, Yamato trotting down the leftmost of them. His future teacher seemed to be more at ease now that they were nearing the end of the journey, taking his time around the dry, sloping terrain. Naruto's pulse was back at a normal rhythm, and he was breathing evenly despite the difficulty of his position. Slower and shallower breaths than he would have liked, but at least it was under control, and that aside he could sense nature chakra as if it was just out of reach. It was teasingly close, but until the cage was dropped, he simply had no other alternative but to bide his time. They passed through several narrow halls in a row over the next few minutes, passing one or two other members of the hidden route. Those others gave Yamato a wide berth even before they took in what he had clasped within his cage, and though it wouldn't have been noticed had he been in any other position, the Jinchuriki recognized the slight tension that flared across his captor's shoulders and neck whenever that occurred. He almost frowned. His muscles couldn't quite shape to that as they were, but even still. Whatever the reason, Yamato seemed to be the lone man out within this group, and it was something that couldn't be suppressed in whole. Naruto's sympathies were set aside as they exited the final hall and emerged into a wide, open chamber surrounded by screens depicting certain sections of the village. The deserted Uchiha compound, empty even of Sasuke at the moment. The outer edges of the Hyuga clan grounds. A few of their disgruntled branch house members serving the main house in flowing gardens. And the rotted civilian sector where Naruto made his own home. The first two would have been surprising enough, but that Danzo Shimura had eyes on his dilapidated area of the village unnerved Naruto greatly. It didn't make sense at all, unless he was ensuring that nothing happened to the Kyuubi's vessel, as had been attempted with Hinata only a few years before. Danzo himself stood facing away from them, his single visible eye perusing the screens as if in deep thought. Without turning around, he spoke up lowly. "Set the boy aside and close the way up behind you, Tenzo. Return in 30 minutes to remove the barrier." Yamato bowed at the waist and slung Naruto's cage carefully to the ground at one side, dropping him the last inch and rattling his bones. Naruto grunted and bit down on the wood blocking up his mouth, eyes narrowing in pain, and the masked shinobi departed through the sole opening after a murmured, "Hi, Danzo-sama." It was impossible to see from his current angle, but both of them heard the rustle of roots stirring to life in the next moments and the overlapping clack of wooden bars crisscrossing. In less than a minute the noise had vanished, and the leader of the hidden route turned to face his prisoner at last. It was in that moment that golden yellow eyes opened up, narrow flat pupils replacing the usual blue orbs, and red highlights bled up from the skin around the sockets in matching slants. Naruto flexed his body and burst through the first bars at the same time his potential opponent met his gaze. The calm the Jinchuriki had developed seemed to flourish even further as he pushed up and broke his left arm free, gradually peeling himself up and out of the remnants of the cage. "Hello, Naruto Namikaze. I see your actions speak far louder than the words I've overheard this afternoon." Naruto blinked at having his father's name applied to him in place of his mother's. I suppose he would have been one of the few to know about that, he conceded after a moment, maintaining his combative stance. He didn't know much of what the old council member could do or how he would react, only having heard bits and pieces from Sai on occasion over the months when they had worked together before the Fourth Shinobi World War. And that mystery unsettled him a little now that he had to confront the man. If he had had his way, they would have never met face to face until after things were well and truly underway, after having a chance to actually find out more about the council as a whole to see if they too would react as the Hokage had after learning about him. A faint niggling on the back of his mind told him to just burst through Yamato's Mokuton contraption sealing up the doorway and make a break for the village proper. But he ignored it for now. Even if he did get through it quickly, the rest of the hidden route would be waiting for him throughout the base, to say nothing of Yamato himself, who was likely stationed nearby even now. He stepped away from the door and glanced at the screens again. Danzo took his silence in stride. "As I was saying, then," he began neutrally. "I've heard the truth of your situation and you make no motion to deny it. I admit my curiosity over your fate, and our respective desires to protect the village may differ in their execution, Namikaze, but that you were so easily ambushed immediately after your arrival here proves that I made the correct decision in having you brought before me now." He paused to give Naruto a chance to respond, but at the further silence he continued, "Were you captured by Kumogakure, or even Iwagakure in my stead? It is probable the Nine Tails would return to wreak havoc upon our village yet again in short order, to say nothing of the information they would have extracted from you before your execution. It would be an utter disaster not unlike the day of your birth. And this time there is no fourth Hokage to sacrifice himself for our greater good. The barb made his hackles raise. So you weren't planning to harm me, but to test my mettle and teach me a lesson? Even as he said it, that sounded absurd in his own ears. If it was anyone other than Yamato that had tried to capture me today, tomorrow, or next week, I could have broken free with little trouble and alerted the Anbu trailing me to the situation. The elder man inclined his head, closing his eye in thought. He spoke up again after a few seconds. "Ah, I see," he stated softly, then reached over to lightly drum his fingers across the metal container over his other arm idly, seemingly shelving the matter for now. "Tell me then, Namikaze. What would you desire to do with the knowledge that you have? I have heard some part from Hiruzen already, but elaborate for me. Perhaps we can come to an agreement that is mutually beneficial. With what you know of to come, and what I already know of what is, our village would be better protected than any other in the elemental nations." Naruto blinked again. For a moment he seemed thrown by the subject change as much as the more welcoming tone of voice compared to before. His arms crossed over his chest as he thought about it. It did sound reasonable to him, for some reason. And what old man Hokage had said earlier on about how certain events could be and already were slightly different in this timeline compared to those that had come to pass in his original one meant that Danzo was probably right. Maybe by sharing his foreknowledge he could better help to defend Konoha from Orochimaru, from Nagato, the Akatsuki, and of course, Madara Uchiha. All of those threats he would have to track down on his own as it was if he wanted to do something about them, for it seemed clear that the Hokage would not willingly aid him. But if he had an ally in the endeavor, particularly one in position to convince the Hokage to go along with things, then it might very well be possible to fix what he wanted to fix and ensure the village was completely safe from the trouble to come. The Anbu would know to be wary at all of the right times, the Hokage prepared to directly intervene, the council alert for misinformation flowing in from their scouts abroad. He opened his mouth to answer and that niggling sense on the back of his mind redoubled. A faint howl radiating up from the depths of his mind. He recognized the sound after a moment as being the voice of the fox growling at him, and it instantly brought back memories of their irritation and struggle against one another throughout the years until finally culminating in the encounter where he had defeated the Kyuubi and gained full access to its chakra. He pushed the Nine Tails' quiet threats to the back of his mind and tilted his head up to stare at the older nin, momentarily shaken. "How do I know you won't misuse that information?" he asked. "I know old man Hokage wants to do what is best for everyone, and so would you." Danzo drummed his fingers more heavily against the metal shell, the sound reverberating like a steel drum. "Be that as it may, Namikaze, would you rather not attempt to convey a sense of impregnable defense and strength about Konoha first and foremost, so that when our envoys are sent out to work on a peace treaty someday with the rest of the hidden villages, they know that they must take our offers seriously?" Naruto began to speak, but he was cut off as Danzo continued. "You need look no further than the Hyuga incident 4 years ago to see how they view us now, Namikaze. We have been humiliated too often in the past, and will continue to be in the future, of what I have heard." Naruto sighed, an abrupt tiredness coming over him. He felt like he wanted to trust the old shinobi, but at the same time as if he knew that he should not. The fox's howls had diminished when it became clear that he would not answer them, but they still rippled against the edge of his attention span, refusing to vanish altogether. It was an annoyance that, when coupled with his unease, was getting under his skin. Danzo only exacerbated the issue with that constant drumming of his fingers in an almost irregular rhythm of taps and pauses. "I need a few moments of quiet," he thought, rubbing at his forehead wearily, as if to soothe a headache. Without even quite realizing it, he had slipped out of sage mode. "Well, Namikaze? Will you honor your father's name and efforts to defend Konoha by working with me, and the hidden root, in the shaping of the coming future?" What had begun as an even, perhaps even grateful tone of voice, took on an edge of steel as he uttered, "Or will you squander your wealth of knowledge and leave our borders undefended from the many menaces lurking ahead?" Of course he wanted to protect Konoha. That was part of why he even wanted to start working on things now, such as going out to Suna to try and calm Gaara, to find some way to work with Nagato before he was immersed in his pain alter ego, and to put a stop to Orochimaru's experiments before he could come after Sasuke again one day. What cinched the matter for him was what Danzo had said near the start, that the Hokage had confided in him about the information Naruto had already shared, a fact that almost made him frown. "All right," he said, sitting down on the floor and closing his eyes to concentrate. By the time he had sat down, the distrust was gone, as if it had never been present on his mind. He spoke about what was nearest then, at least what he intended to start upon: infiltrating Sanagakure and putting a stop to the life Gaara had led. Else he would become a pawn of Otogakure, Orochimaru, and the case cage during the invasion several years later. But Danzo waved a dismissive hand and interrupted him. No matter Suna for now, Namikaze. Tell me of all the traitor Sanin, and Omegakure in particular. Not even shrugging, he adjusted track and spoke of seeking out Jiraiya and Tsunade in their distant locations so that they could be brought back to the village, to help in putting a stop to their wayward teammates' actions. The older man asked for location names, but all he had were faint ideas. The same for Orochimaru. Even the Hokage might not have the pertinent information regarding better than remote guesses for where Jiraiya himself was, let alone the other two. But as his words turned to the Toad Sage, the memories of Jiraiya's training and their 2.5-year journey together began to filter to the surface. Quick flashes that brought up the different emotions ingrained within them before they were stifled. His features turned into a pained grimace as his mind warred with itself, trying to suppress something. When at last his thoughts settled upon the moment when he learned of Jiraiya's demise in AIM, however, that something seemed to stir and cut off the flow of words past his lips. A throb developed behind his eyes as the pupils abruptly became jagged, and the old whisker-marked scars along each cheek took on heightened highlights. His incisors sharpened and he felt the fox's voice echo inside of his skull, too far away to make out the words at first but growing in strength with every beat of his heart, until he had unconsciously hanged into his older, 16-year-old body and clothing again. At last, the Kyuubi's voice growled inside of his mind, a single slitted orange eye glaring at him therein with venom. You have been under his genjutsu mind control, you little fool. Stop speaking before you reveal everything to him. Naruto blinked his eyes back open and shook his head, trying to clear it. As soon as the thought occurred that he was being manipulated, the niggling in the back of his mind surged to the forefront and overwhelmed his senses. A foreign chakra standing out now that he knew it was there. And he knew that he had indeed been tricked into speaking precious secrets better kept under lock and key. It felt like a fuzz had lifted from his thoughts and eyes and revealed the truth standing before him once more. Hello, Naruto Namikaze. I see your actions speak far louder than the words I've overheard this afternoon. Overheard? Danzo's very first words to him, which had been dampened by the genjutsu, rang now with an echoing clarity over and over again as he looked back at that moment. The Hokage wouldn't have risked alterations to the timeline so soon by confiding in the council. That was why he had said to wait, to get time to think and ponder the information and how it could play out, rather than allow him to rush off and begin implementing his knowledge. You lied to me, Naruto said slowly and quietly, his head dropping down into one hand as he fought to control his overbearing emotions. The enforced calm from their discussion was disintegrating beneath the maelstrom evoked at his time spent with Jiraiya, the good and bad together bleeding into one, and as Danzo's genjutsu was forcibly strangled and destroyed by the Kyuubi's malicious chakra flowing through his veins, giving him strength, a whispered anger that he had been manipulated in such a way started to encompass it all. Danzo's own eye opened in full, watching him with a hint of contempt even as his fingers continued calmly dancing over the metal shell in what was clearly Morse code, sending out messages to whomever was listening beyond this room. Perhaps I have, but I told you at the start that my desire to protect this village may not be agreeable from your own point of view. My offer remains to aid you even now, Jinchuriki. Join with the root and share your knowledge freely and you will always be protected, and perhaps even allowed some measure of freedom to roam the various districts of Konoha still when its borders have been proven beyond foreign access. His voice was no longer even the slightest bit pleasant. It came out clipped, hard, giving no compromise, and he reached into a pocket to draw a single kunai for defense. Naruto lifted his head and stared at the other man with something akin to heated malice etched into his gaze, slowly rising to his feet. It was returned with cold indifference, and then a slow and weary sigh emerged from the older man. I see now that you are the same as all the rest born to this village besides myself, the second, and Orochimaru, he began. So willing to succumb to your base emotions rather than execute your duty to the sake of Konoha. You are a shinobi, a tool to be wielded in more capable hands, cutting only as directed, and yet as a weapon you are blunted by your inability to act only as told. You are little more than a liability to us, Jinchuriki. Exactly as the others I have seen throughout my life. He scoffed, lifting the kunai to his mouth and exhaling a swirl of molded mint green chakra along its blade. In a moment what had begun as a small knife had become a small sword, and Danzo Shimura looked back at him steadily. I would have yet had you prepared to aid us rather than risk opposing us in the hands of Kumogakure, Iwagakure, Kiwigakure, Sanagakure, or Omegakure, but you would take that chance, just as the second did. Now you will be subdued and subjugated until my will is your own. I already told you I won't be made into anyone's pawn. Naruto bit out around clenched teeth. And I won't allow you to take advantage of the information you stole from me, either. His fingers began to twitch as bubbling vermilion chakra bled up from his pores, ensconcing the younger shinobi in the old, well-familiar chakra cloak of the 9 tails. Only 2 of said tails flicked back and forth from just beneath the base of his spine, slapping against each other in agitation and scraping rents in the stone floor, but he did not need them all to subdue and capture his opponent before he could do anything. A moment later, the wall of overlapping roots exploded into motion behind Naruto's back. And that's it. Kakashi finished explaining what all he had gotten out of Sasuke. The young Uchiha looked uncomfortable to be in the Hokage's office yet again, glancing around at everything in muted curiosity even though he had already seen much of it several months ago in the wake of his family's massacre. Hiruzen grimaced. Do you think you can identify the Anbu member based off of what scant details you have? He questioned. Kakashi closed his normal eye and thought. Not many would willingly choose the unofficially retired fox mask for this task, for obvious reasons. Dog masks on the other hand. After running through those he remembered from a few months ago when he left the group, Kakashi nodded his head. Yes, Hokage-sama, unless you've signed orders to promote any other Jonin to the Anbu squad since I left, it should be possible to narrow in on a man. He stated. Hiruzen nodded his head and gestured to the child standing off to the side, an inquiring look in his eyes. Kakashi nodded his head again in understanding. The Uchiha heir has agreed, he said in a neutral tone. Very well. As I said before, dredge up the paperwork and bring it here. But that must take a back seat to confirming which Enbu has kidnapped Naruto and why. Kakashi glanced down at Sasuke and recognized the body language he was using with a frown. Yes, Hokage-sama, he agreed without turning toward him. Do you wish to remain here or follow me and help confirm the mask features, Sasuke? He asked the child. Sasuke hadn't expected the question and started, looking up at him. Do I have to? He asked softly. Kakashi shrugged. The boy frowned but nodded his head, wanting to get this whole process over and done with and get away from the place where he had been taken to so soon after losing everything, where the memories of that night were more easily refreshed. He had gradually gotten used to seeing the empty streets and remnants of the Uchiha compound, but here he was brought back to the blood and the bodies scattered everywhere. Kakashi reached down and snagged the boy again, jolting him back to the moment and making him shake his head violently to clear away the lingering dead ingrained in his mind's eye. With your leave, Hokage-sama? He asked. Hiruzen watched Sasuke for a moment in concern, then waved a dismissal at them and turned to go back to his desk and stack of unfinished paperwork waiting to be signed and dealt with, knowing that he would likely ponder the youngest Uchiha's fate the same as he had Naruto's prior. Kakashi nodded and dashed off toward Anbu headquarters. There was a traitor in that midst, and his late mentor's son may not be the only one subdued for the unknown events playing out. Danzo flashed across the distance even as Naruto spun about in alarm, momentarily taken off guard by the barrage of wood that surged toward his position. A momentary glimpse of white porcelain revealed itself as Yamato's mask behind the shuffling chaos. One of his chakra tails spun upright and shielded his neck by instinct as Danzo's windblade struck at the base of his spine, aiming to temporarily incapacitate him, but he had no time to retaliate directly, forced into slashing at the roots with the suddenly developed chakra claws over his fingernails as his secondary tail snapped out in an idle pot shot toward the root leader's gut. The first batch of bulging tendrils were cut to ribbons and fell apart hissing where the fox's chakra had touched them, but 2 and 3 more burst forth and rushed through the opening to replace them, and he fell back and leapt across the wide room, unconsciously reaching out and catching Danzo's next blow aimed for his head across his upraised right arm instead. The weapon bubbled and grew pockmarked initially at the contact, disintegrating the edge, but the elder shinobi simply released it and drew another kunai, expertly dancing amidst Yamato's Mokuton assault as if they had trained for this very operation day in and day out. I need backup, Naruto realized. He bared his teeth and slammed his hands through the ancient hand seals of the Shadow Clone Jutsu, and two nearly identical imitations appeared from smoke next to him. They lacked the same degree of Biju chakra and thus held only a single tail, the fox unwilling to share its strength any further, but it was enough to grant them some measure of a chakra cloak and the enhanced durability within it. The next moment they were swarmed again. Naruto was able to dedicate some attention to countering Danzo directly while his clones shredded the roots around them, lunging forward and blocking the second wind-enhanced knife with his hand even as he brought the other up and slashed at the council member's torso. He had no more success now than when he had tried before, as Danzo slid back and vanished amidst the wood, only to reappear from another direction. After the fourth such bout, however, the older nin did not show himself again. The longer Naruto waited, slicing through the roots, the greater his unease rose. The Kyuubi spared a moment to answer. He is waiting for you to wear yourself out, boy. Or else fleeing even now to commit his next atrocities throughout the lands. Now stop wasting my precious strength and finish this job. A grimace spread across his features. He jumped even further back into the open space at his back and his clones followed after a moment. Without even needing to speak, he held his hands in the motions of the wind release. Rasen Shuriken technique, and they recognized his intent, providing the needed shape transformation and nature transformation while he supplied the chakra. Yamato's Mokuton devoured the 20-foot distance in just seconds, and in just seconds, the greater experience at his aid gave Naruto the time needed to finalize the essence of his attack. For the moment, it did not occur to him exactly what he was about to do, focused only upon catching up to Danzo and halting him directly. He thrust his arm forward and threw the Rasen Shuriken with all his might. The blue-white construct cut through the wood as if it wasn't there, eradicating every tendril in its wake, and then almost too late, Naruto remembered that it was Yamato commanding the opposing ninjutsu. His breath hitched and his posture shifted in the next instant. His eyes flared into cross-shaped pupils, red highlights erupted beneath his eyes, and the awaiting senjutsu chakra brewing in his gut encompassed his entire body. He felt the fox's outrage and sent a single thought across their uneasy bond even as he shunshined forward, "Shut up and help me." The edges of his vision blurred. He could see his technique approaching Yamato at a pace that the older nin had no hope of evading, especially blind by the Mokuton still obscuring the doorway. There was barely even the usual screech of noise as it flowed forward without resistance, and even if Yamato heard the quieter shriek in time, his body simply couldn't react in such a short distance. Naruto himself ducked down as he approached, right arm outstretched. He refused to be responsible for killing his future teacher no matter what Yamato was involved in here and now. Indentations were burned into the rock and cracks spread outward from there as he drove his feet harder and harder, measuring time in half-second increments. Yamato's mask and parts of his torso could be seen through the gaps in the overlapping wood, the way his body had stiffened and was attempted to pull away apparent. But he was closer, narrowing the distance. Another heavy step, the cracks widening, the screech louder. Another, his fingers nearly close enough to shift the Rasen Shuriken with Frog Kata. Another foot of distance eaten as the first white edge cut into the doorway, Naruto nearly stumbling as his hand drove into the wood. And then, at last, his arm and upper body bursting through the surface even as Yamato's flak jacket began to shred, the slightest flare of copper scent suffusing his nostrils to signify blood. And Naruto pushed the root Anbu down and aside with his left hand and then thrust at the deadly technique to offset it with his right, crashing into Yamato and dragging him away as his attack soared upward and to the far end of the hall, wobbling in air and carving a trench through the ceiling the whole way through. The very air quivered in the instant before 2 tons of jagged stone fell upon them, Jinchuriki and Anbu taken by surprise. And further ahead, the Rasen Shuriken exploded where it finally collided with a wall, blowing out a 1/4 ton of stone and streaming muted sunlight through the dust. Hiruzen raised his head from the arch his hands had formed, elbows locked into place flat against his desk. Not only had one of his most steadfast of Jonin unexpectedly deviated and adopted the last Uchiha in the village the same day as a timeline displaced Naruto Uzumaki arrived, But then the wayward Jinchuriki had managed to entangle himself in a scheme dating back at least a decade. Said boy was resting up unconscious inside of the hospital at the moment with a double duty of personally selected Anbu to watch over him. Where exactly Danzo Shimura had vanished to in the last few hours he did not know, but injured root personnel were turning up left, right, and everywhere in between inside of the hidden base discovered within the Hokage monument that very evening, which said enough. The root were supposed to have been disbanded long ago. He sighed warily and looked down to the open report laying on his desk from the head of the torture and interrogation force, Ibiki Morino, describing the incident and information obtained from the breaking of the fox-faced kidnapper, Tenzo. He glanced over the first few pages and skimmed through the report. Like the rest of the hidden root seated throughout the regular Anbu troops and being recovered from their base, this Tenzo bears a Juinjutsu upon his tongue that has rendered him incapable of directly answering our questions. What little we've been able to uncover since he willingly left the hospital room and sat down before us has come only after breaking through it at the unfortunate cost of his vocal cords. His tongue remains heavily injured by the backlash of the seal failing. The ability to speak is unlikely to return even if he makes a full recovery. That was disturbing in and of itself, but he was simply uncertain what to make of the next paragraph. It appears that he intervened after bringing Uzumaki to their base for unknown purposes. The diminutive roots barely supporting a couple tons of stone over their heads when we reached them while the rest of the base was left to fend for itself lends credence to his writing. No other signs of traitorous activity has been, pardon the pun, rooted out of his personal history so far. Hitaki Kakashi and the Uchiha brat confirmed he's the one they were looking for. So he kidnapped Naruto and delivered the boy to Danzo, and then what? Defends him from some sort of vendetta? Surely Danzo had better control over his subordinates than that. There was just too much that he did not know, and until Naruto woke up, he would have to wait to find out. But it could not be coincidence that the root was unearthed after a decade in hiding today. He reached down for the pipe laying unattended nearby and lifted it to his lips, taking a dry inhalation on the mostly finished tobacco. It left a sour taste down into his lungs and he grimaced, dumping the ashes into the waste bin the next moment, and refilled it from the pouch in his top drawer. Then he thought better of wasting more in idle thought and set them both aside, grabbing the report and marching out of his office. There was one other he could turn to for more answers. Tenzo looked up as the doors of the interrogation room swung upon and admitted the Hokage himself. He tried to smile at his village leader, but his lips wouldn't quite form the right shape and it hurt too badly to want to anyway. He bowed instead and remained there, his forehead pressed to the cold steel and eyes closed, until the Hokage made an impatient noise for him to sit upright again. A thin sheaf of papers landed in front of him. Clearly the report Morino had compiled from his agonized answers a short while ago. A pen clacked and rolled to a halt beside them. He blinked in surprise that he had been given any kind of tool, let alone one as viable as a weapon in the right hands, after what had happened so far. He glanced back at his commander. You seem to be changing positions very regularly, the Hokage told him dryly. And yet I know from your files that you are not a disloyal man. Unless Danzo has reached in and replaced them as well. If it was meant as a joke, neither man laughed. Tell me why and what you have done today, Tenzo. He looked back to the pen and papers, then reached out and flipped over one sheet, writing down his thoughts, actions, and reasoning behind them. It was not overtly long, simply relaying what he believed was necessary for the good of the village. He set the pen aside when he was done and turned the sheet to the Hokage for inspection. Nothing new was there that had not already been gleaned from Morino's insights, except for the last lines. The boy charged into his own attack to spare my life. He could have stood back and allowed me to die, as I had been told to expect while Danzo-sama retreated. I could not have stopped that technique with any nen, ken, or juinjutsu in my arsenal, and I expected to re-enter the pure world at last in the next seconds when I heard, and saw it. And then he appeared, garbed in the demon fox's flesh, face a flurry of emotions. Yet not one of them was anger, or hate, or a desire to see me dead. I saw only determination etched out of fear. I was reminded in those brief, eternally long moments, that Naruto Uzumaki is not the vessel of the Kyuubi out of choice. I don't know what happened when we hit the floor together and then rolled apart, but I saw the collapse of the ceiling while he did not. I simply repaid the favor he had already delivered. Tired from borderline chakra exhaustion, Tenzo leaned back and waited to hear what his fate would be, execution or imprisonment. So long as they let him sleep for a few hours first, he would go without complaint. The Hokage stared at his message for a long time, and then looked at him for even longer. Then he reached over and severed the rope binding his wrists together, and stepped back. Very well, John and Tenzo. Let me escort you back to a hospital bed until your wounds are sufficiently healed. I'll pass judgment once, not if, Naruto Uzumaki awakens. It took them some time to identify what type of jutsu it was that held Naruto paralyzed. Yamato was able to rule out taijutsu or a seal acting out like his own head earlier, and eventually the Sandaime realized it was a mind technique after yet again reviewing the information available to them. Well, there's nothing for it. We can't unbind him without locating where the effect has taken root. Sarutobi stated tiredly. Naruto, I must ask that you continue to fight against the effects. It could be hours or it could be days before the technique wears off. He continued while looking the boy in the eyes. For now you must rest. In the morning we will see what your condition is, he concluded. Naruto grimaced as best he could at them. A fair distance later that night and moonlight filtered down through the clouds around Suna as the 9-man team plus Danzo himself entered the valley leading into the hidden village of sand. The guards ahead bore no importance to him. As they approached in their pale tan cloaks, one of the guardsmen stepped forward and raised his left hand in a warning to halt. A moment passed before he turned back toward the other two watching the entrance and gestured them closer to himself. What is it? One asked gruffly, looking toward the stilled group. Search them. I don't trust my genjutsu resistance at close range, the first man answered. The other two gave noises of annoyance but did as told. You will permit yourself to search and refusal of entrance if we so deem it, the gruff guardsman stated. One of them stepped closed and nodded his head. Together the guards stripped off his cloak and hood and surveyed the basic cloth wrapped about the upper and lower body like those of the other peasants around Sanagakure. The battered headband declared the frail old man as one of Kusa's shinobi. Tisking in distaste, they gave him one final once-over before pushing him roughly forward and heading toward the others. The old man kept his footing and reached down to recover his cloak, slowly drawing it around his neck and shoulders before dragging his way past the original guard and stopping at the edge of the valley. One by one the others were stripped of their cloaks and confirmed to be just as bad off if not worse than the old man, all of varying ages between 20 and 40. As before they were allowed to pass, despite the kusa and intermixed otogakure handbands they all wore. Go to the nearest reserve until dawn. The owner will relocate you to somewhere useful, the third guard told the last of the lot. A silent nod was his only answer and the guard shoved him a little harder than needed in response. Once they were all free of the valley and at least a good distance within the borders of Suna, the frail old man approached the wall surrounding the village and rested against it tiredly. No one saw his hand performing slow and deliberate seals. No one noticed as 5 points burned to life at the edges of his fingertips and sank into the stone. A short time later and no one saw the group of them sink down into the sand before the wall and vanish from sight, and when the morning came the guardsmen would have no memory of a group of outcasts wandering into the village near midnight. The root had found a new house within Suna, even if their true home still lay in Konoha. A few hours after departing the Hokage's office, however, and despite his seeming eagerness to take in the Uchiha survivor, Kakashi wasn't entirely sure what to do with the silent and brooding child after the paperwork had been signed and processed. What little he actually owned was relocated from his family's grounds and delivered to the small and Spartan outcrop of the Hekate dwelling on the far side of Konoha. Sasuke didn't really seem very eager to get the whole process underway either. He just looked around himself as if in question. At length he turned toward Kakashi and intoned, "Where's the rest of your house?" earning a small laugh from the Junin. "This is it. One bedroom, a kitchenette, and bathroom," he responded, glancing around at his own simplistic house. A bedroll was resting against one corner with a small safe beside it full of his Icha Icha Paradise series. A short-cropped magazine rack next to that with 2 or 3 other books and a small plaque hanging above the doorway through which they had just entered bearing his father's white tanto. Sasuke frowned. "No training equipment?" he asked after taking a quick look around the 3 rooms. How could he become stronger without it? There were several devices back at his home back at the site of the massacre, that his family had utilized. No, nothing that would be fit for a child to use. I mostly use the joint grounds of the other Junin when I need to do such. Kakashi answered. Taking in the look the boy gave him drew out another chuckle and the copycat ninja added, "But I can acquire something for your age soon enough." Sasuke sighed. "I need to get stronger now," he stated firmly. Kakashi cocked an eyebrow at him but the child's resolve held. With a sound of consideration the elder shinobi motioned for Sasuke to follow him back through the doorway. After a few moments' hesitation he did so. There are many exercises designed to exhaust and rebuild your body. Some are more physically demanding and draw out your endurance, while others are tailored to your chakra. "Do you want to begin them separate or together, Sasuke?" the Junin asked. "I need everything to surpass him," the child thought. "Together," he said aloud. Kakashi hid a sigh but nodded his head and looked off toward another house some distance away. "You may be seeing Maida Guy sooner than expected, Sasuke," he thought, running through the list. There really wasn't much fit for an 8-year-old. Hell, these exercises shouldn't even have been used against most Chunin. But if Sasuke wanted to get started, then he may as well adapt what his rival was using if in a milder tone. "Very well. We'll start tonight and stop at midnight. The next session will begin at noon and last until 4, then rest until 8 to midnight again," Kakashi told him. He did not turn to see if the Uchiha reacted unfavorably or otherwise to the schedule yet. "We'll begin with a fairly simple technique if you haven't already been taught it, tree climbing," he added. Sasuke made a disgruntled noise and Kakashi turned toward him. "Without your hands," the Junin stated. As if to prove his point at the child's disbelieving look, Kakashi walked up to the nearest tree and stepped right up its side, turning around to look at the ground and the boy beneath him several feet away. Sasuke looked back at him before slowly walking forward and pressing one foot to the trunk tentatively. It didn't feel any different. "You must channel your chakra into the soles of your shoes first," Kakashi explained when Sasuke glanced back up at him in question. Drawing 1 foot away he allowed his white chakra to shine through the boot and light up the child's face. Sasuke turned away from it and concentrated. He could feel his chakra moving around and rushing through his legs down to his feet, leaving a slightly burned sensation behind as he pushed enough in to make his feet glow like the shinobi above him had. Uh-oh. Quickly realizing the mistake he had just made, Kakashi dropped down and yanked Sasuke away just as the boy pressed his foot back to the bark, earning an explosion of wood that mostly scattered over the Junin's backside. Sasuke scowled up at him. "Look what happened," he demanded. "If you didn't pull me away I could have climbed right up it," he added. Kakashi set the boy down. No, that was my mistake. You would have been blown away with so much chakra flowing down to your feet. Tell me, do your legs hurt from channeling your chakra through them?" he asked. Sasuke grimaced. "I'll take that for a yes. You should never send so much to any part of your body that it shines as I had demonstrated or becomes painful either. You're overloading the coils throughout your body when that happens," he explained. The Uchiha heir pulled out of his grip and approached the tree again. Taking a breath he pressed his foot against the bark and was knocked onto his back as the wood burst beneath it again. Slightly numbed from the blow where fragments had hit him, the 8-year-old stared at the empty hole where his foot had pressed against the tree. Behind him Kakashi sighed again. "Try to push only enough that you can feel the flow as a warmth. If it becomes overly hot again, slow the flow down or you're using up too much and will become exhausted quickly," he instructed. Sasuke pushed up to his feet a little slower than before and tried to do as told. It was, he discovered, harder to do than when he had pushed at it a few minutes earlier. "What do you want now, boy?" the Kyuubi's voice growled at him. Naruto sighed and walked forward, turning around and placing his back and head against the cage just beneath the seal and sliding down it. "They can't figure out what's wrong with my body," he stated flatly. The fox stared at his impudence for treating itself like a subdued pet, as though it couldn't rend the flesh from his bones at that range to the gate. It growled at him and Naruto glanced over one shoulder. "Ah, so sorry your highness," he added in the same tone and rolled away a moment later as one of the fox's paws reached through the cage to slash at where his head had just rested. "Look, the moment you vanished I couldn't keep up with Sage Mode any longer, and that jutsu Danzo used took full effect. I'm potentially screwed for days if it even wears off at all," Naruto explained. The Kyuubi growled at him. "Come on. If something happens to my body topside we're both dead," he pleaded. Its nails flickered back and forth in further agitation before slamming against the cage sharply and making him jump. Do something about this cage and I'll do something about your body. Otherwise, it trailed off darkly. Naruto stared at it, silently asking what it would do. Revealing its multitude of teeth, the Kyuubi finished its thought. Otherwise, I don't have to manifest the next time your life's in danger. Let your precious sage mode do the work for once. Figures. Why did I even bother? Naruto thought. Shaking his head, he turned to walk away. Forget it. Sandaime will work something out eventually, he called back. The fox's eyes narrowed at being dismissed and it leveled further killing intent against his retreating backside. You'll regret that soon enough, boy. Panting, legs raw and burning with exhaustion, Sasuke pushed to his feet yet again. Kakashi had glanced at his watch several times and silently wished it to go faster to no avail as midnight was in no hurry to come. The marks in the tree showed just how high the Uchiha air had made it over the last hour and a half. He no longer listened to Kakashi when the Junin tried to get him to rest. He would not fail such a simple exercise. He would master this technique before sunrise, even if it killed him. Ignoring the pain as he channeled chakra back through his legs to his feet, Sasuke kicked off from a few feet away and ran at the battered bark of the tree. His shoes partially sank into the surface yet again as he made it to the same point Kakashi had before the bark collapsed and he stumbled, falling to the ground. Kakashi winced yet again as the boy hit shoulder first into the ground, though at least it had been weakened into a softer soil to allow him to soak up the damage easier. Pushing his Hite-8 up and staring at Sasuke's chakra coils, he grimaced as they ignited under the strain and made the process all the harder and more painful. If the child didn't stop and rest soon at the rate he was burning through his reserves, it seemed even more unlikely that he would reach the title of Chunin. Get up and do it again. Sasuke berated himself in his brother's voice, picturing Itachi's image before him. Hatred burned to the surface and he pushed up to his feet again, ignoring the slight sway and the agony it incited. The protesting of his muscles meant nothing. Glaring hard enough to set the tree alight, Sasuke kicked off from the loose dirt and drove each foot against the tree sharply. He was just slightly higher than Kakashi when he gave out again, and as before he rose to his feet after a few seconds, and again he pushed himself. At last he fell and could rise no further, gasping through the pain and frustration of it all, and still seeing his brother's scowling image above, mocking him all the while. We must locate firstly who, and secondly where, the One-Tail's host is. Danzo ordered the 9 men around him. They no longer wore the white animal masks of the Konoha Anbu, for that would have been a dead giveaway if they were caught here. Instead, most of them had adapted their clothing and armoring to mirror the local Sunanen. One or two was indeed dressed as a peasant would in order to blend in with the poor. Whatever was said at each level of the people would be heard and relayed back to Danzo. The genjutsu seal placed over the entrance varies from that we had used in Konoha. The Hokage will likely see Tenzo spared once he is caught, if for no reason than to try and unmask our operations in Konoha. Even should he be employed to try and follow us and by chance arrive in Suna, to see the whole that no one else does would be unforgivable, he explained. As such, the key to the seal on each of you must be altered. Once that is done with, your task will begin. It goes without saying that you should not bring any greater attention to our company than needed. Let us begin. As the sun rose over Konoha, a young boy stared up at the pale orange sky in a state of exhaustion. The bark scattered across the area ran as far as a dozen feet away, and the soles of his shoes had cracked and melted long ago, inciting burns and blisters to the feet within. And yet all that mattered to the small raven-haired child was the awkward trail of indentations starting at the base of the tree before him and trailing up to the top of its branches. His chakra was long since spent to the final drop. His muscles from mid-chest to toes felt raw and torn, and his flesh around his ankles was caked in dried blood. But he had done it. He had succeeded, and the agony was a welcome side effect for his accomplishment. A soft rustling sound from behind followed by quick footsteps entered the area as Kakashi slid off the roll-up bed 5 meters back from the tree. Well done, he stated quietly as he reviewed the extent of destruction to the boy's chakra coils through the Sharingan. It'll be months before he can make up for this one task, the Junin thought. It may be possible to proceed with the taijutsu exercises at a milder rate, but any excess strain could permanently damage what's left of his legs. Hoisting the Uchiha heir into the air by the back of his shirt and ignoring the groan of protest, Kakashi carefully brought him over to the rumpled bed and laid him down on it. You succeeded in tree walking at the cost of nearly 6 months of other training. 3 months at the very earliest, he stated. Sasuke made a noise of protest. Quiet, your legs are so damaged they can't support your weight even with crutches, and the chakra paths running through them are all but torn open in several places. That more so than anything will take the longest to heal over. 6 months. I can't waste that kind of time. His thoughts turned from desperation to an agonized groan of more pain as he tried to move one leg into an upright position, and felt like he had dipped it into a pit of boiling flame instead. Kakashi scoffed above him. We're going to the hospital. I'll find something for you to work on in 1 week to keep your mind off of your legs, but I expect you to actually listen when I train you from now on, Uchiha. Hold on, Kakashi warned as he gripped the edges of the top and bottom of the bedroll and lifted it into the air so as to mostly keep Sasuke's body in a slight slope. Another noise of pain and protest escaped the boy's lips instead of his agreement or disagreement toward the last subject, and then they were on their way. A few minutes later, however, and Maeda Guy finished his first loop around Konoha in time to see the damage to the tree. The unexpected sight made him do a double take and slow in his jog. He exclaimed. What determined foe struck down such a host of loveliness into this state? His eyes trailed over to the house of his eternal rival only a short distance away. Guy shook his head with the decision to investigate properly very shortly. I do not know yet, but I shall uncover this truth or do another 200 laps around Konoha. On my hands, he swore with a determined glint in his eyes. Naruto blinked his eyes open and stretched tiredly, or he would have, if his muscles were not still locked up. The effect was fading with time, but nothing wanted to respond to his commands more than the occasional twitch. He felt like screaming in frustration. Thankfully, someone had forced his body into a relaxed state and he was currently laying down on a fold-out mattress a short distance behind the Hokage's desk. The pale morning light shining in through the windows came to a rest across his face, which happened to be what had awoken him. Oh, great. Now I've got to deal with a face full of sunshine and no way to escape? He thought dismally. No way. I'm getting out of this stupid jutsu if I have to drag the Kyuubi's 9 tails to the surface one at a time. He swore. Unfortunately for him, the fox seemed rather intent on denying him its chakra. A minute's swearing didn't help his situation out, after straining to no avail. At length he clenched his eyes shut and began trying to relax again. Gotta calm down. Gotta calm down. Naruto chanted as his stomach rumbled pitifully up at him. Try and gather the energy around you. The effort was far harder than before his body decided to lock itself up. 10 minutes passed before he could feel the swirl of natural power gathering around his form in slow spirals. It felt vaguely awkward from the usual manner of gathering, but Sage Chakra was Sage Chakra. He gathered it into his form and focused intently on what he wanted. Around his eyes the usual red-orange tinge formed as the pupils shifted accordingly to a shade of yellow with the horizontal dash marks. A pain in the back of his mind nearly distracted him from completing the transformation into Sage mode, and it continued to grow with every second that passed. RRRGH. Pushing through it, he felt and heard a soft crack echo throughout his mind, and the muscles around his arms collapsed from their taut state back to normal. The rest of his body remained as it was, however. Grunting through the burn as he brought his arms up before him to perform the shadow clone technique, he sent 2 of them to gather up the Hokage before focusing on keeping his Sage Chakra up. A minute and much startled noise and exclamations of surprise later, and the Sandaime was standing over him in a night robe with the 2 duplicates at his back. Naruto waved weakly at him before gesturing down at the rest of his stiff body. What happened? Sarutobi asked him in concern. A clone answered tiredly for him. He's in Sage mode. The fox is in a snit and won't give up any chakra to counteract the jutsu like it did when we fought Danzo yesterday. And after it sealed up its power, he ran out of Sage Chakra and the jutsu won out in the end. Sarutobi glanced between them. Did you hear or see what Danzo know? Why am I asking? Turning back to Naruto, the old Hokage leaned down and stared into his eyes. If you could focus on the events of yesterday, I could more clearly define just what has happened to you, he stated. Naruto matched his gaze after a hesitant moment, though unlike the last time as the ninjutsu was used, Sarutobi did not wheel away in discomfort. He stood up straighter and dug into his robe for a pipe. It has been a very long time since I last saw Shimura Danzo in combat. Though it startles me to see he possessed a Sharingan, I have seen the technique he utilized against you before, he said in a considering tone. His clones did not have the patience to wait around. Well, what is it? One asked. Sarutobi took a few steps away to light the pipe and slide down into his chair before answering. It belonged to a member of the Uchiha, of course, of that much I am quite certain. This isn't one of their traditional genjutsu or the like, however, as I had previously suspected it to be. No, this is but a very rare dojutsu unseen in Konoha since before the massacre, he explained. That Danzo can wield it explains all too much. I have little doubt what he was able to do to the council over the last year, if indeed it has been merely that little a time since he obtained it, the Sandame stated with a low sigh, and his expression hardened after a moment. That he could compel a number of Anbu to betray their Hokage's trust and authority in the manner in which he did can also be attributed in part to the dojutsu. I cannot recall which Uchiha it was that bore this dojutsu, but it would not matter if I did. What I do know is that its effects can be defeated. Sarutobi looked over at the real Naruto. Unfortunately, it will take more than merely my skill to undo it. You must find the will to overcome the binding effects on your own, and once overthrown the grasp it has over your mind will be shattered. Stop it. Leave me alone. A small red-haired child's voice rang throughout the area he was in. Tears ran down his face as he raised one arm defensively against the black-armored shinobi wielding a katana a short distance away, and already droplets of blood splattered the edges of the blade and the sands around them from the thin slash marks running over the child's back. The assassin grunted in annoyance and leapt into the air with his blade raised overhead. Looking up at the gleaming metal descending at his head yet again, the boy dove forward out of its direct path and received another cut over his shoulders for it. One foot shot backwards and descended to press down on the boy's back with more than enough force to shove him down into the sand an inch. Spitting out as much as he could and scrambling to get his feet and arms under him, the child cried out in pain as his cuts were cruelly ground on, even as the shinobi turned around without lifting his foot away from them. And now you die. Swinging the sword around and lifting it just over the back of the neck, the shinobi thrust downward to finish him off. The tip cut into his flesh before halting on what felt like a steel rod. What? Pillars of sand rose up and wrapped about the assassin's lower legs and simply squeezed, and after only moments a dull crack followed by a sound like mud being trudged through escaped the entrapment, sending a deluge of crimson through it. The shinobi's screams carried on far louder than the boy's shouts had. Held in place by what remained of his legs, he could only watch though his pain as more sand spiraled through the air around his body in a loose manner, before steadily growing thicker. His attempts to slash his way free were met with futility as more and more sand rose up into a flowing 360-degree radius ring before suddenly shrinking in width, and rising up to form a perfect sphere just above the pillars holding his legs. A soft rush of air followed as it wrapped tightly around the body and soared and squeezed. The assassin's final agonized shout was terminated midway through as he was reduced to a fountain of blood with the same squelching noise accompanied by a terrible screech of rending metal. The now red sand descended to the floor again with a piece of awkwardly shaped metal the size of a crumpled kunai rolling free of it. Moments later a panting Gaara pushed up from beneath it with eyes streaked through with further tears at the sight of the red sand all around him. Didn't mean to. I didn't mean to. I didn't mean to. He thought desperately, mouthing the words over and over again as his eyes roamed from the sand to the few villagers nearby and back again. A short distance away a peasant observed the encounter and mentally went over everything that he had just observed seen to report it back to his master. Sasuke fidgeted in bed the entire time the doctor reviewed him. Kakashi stood nearby with his Sharingan active and described what he could of the damage. He could only see the path and how it flowed, and not the individual junctions as a Hyuga could. I concur with your original estimate of at least 3 months as a very positive earliest. The muscles and ligaments are torn so badly right now that even swinging the legs from side to side would probably tear apart what's left. He'll need to have regular chakra injections for the first month alone to compensate for what he lost last night into this morning in order for his body to begin repairing the damage, the doctor told Kakashi in a low voice. The Junin grimaced beneath his mask. Is there anything that can help him speed up the recovery process? He questioned in the same tone. The doctor shook his head and looked back through the notes he had made so far to confirm it. No, it'll be a small miracle for him to be running again in 6 months without suffering from deterioration in the process. Right now he needs proper rest for the progress to begin, the doctor responded. Facing Sasuke he said aloud, "It will be a long road to recovery, young man, but I fully expect you will succeed in the long run." His intention to infuse the boy with hope went unnoticed. With a sigh he turned back to Kakashi and handed him a sheet of paper regarding when the injections would be expected and the side effects generally associated with them before walking out. Sasuke looked at him. "I heard all of that," the child stated in a tone dulled by the pain medication. "A small miracle," he quoted and trailed off, losing himself to thought. "Ignore that. You're the last of a powerful line, Sasuke. You'll make progress and then some to compensate for this setback," Kakashi told him seriously. The boy didn't look as though he heard or cared. "I'll see what I can do about finding something for training the rest of your body while you're in here." Further silence met his words, and after a moment the Junin exhaled softly and turned his attention to the sheet, then headed out of the room. It wasn't until he was alone that Sasuke spoke again. "Itachi would have found a way to heal in a month. I won't falter. I'll find a way to match that time frame at the least." Hours after it had begun, the throbbing pain in the back of his mind faded away, and with it so too did the restriction keeping his body locked up like it was. It was as though every muscle decided to go flat at once, the way his stiff posture relaxed into the bedroll. Naruto opened his eyes and let out a triumphant snarl, his slightly enlarged incisors bared in a smug grin. "Take that, you stupid fox. I didn't need your help after all." He turned to his 2 clones and they gave him a thumbs up before dispelling. Sitting up almost put him back down the way his body protested, but he pushed through it and rose unsteadily to his feet. The Hokage wasn't in the room, and his memories from the clones told him that the old man had gone to get ready for official duties or some such elsewhere in the tower. His joy slipped a little at that, and he gave a start as Yamato walked in from outside. Without a word he gave a small nod of the head and drew out a small wooden sheet from within his jacket. On it words were etched and the former Anbu and Root member passed it off to the boy. "Huh?" Looking down at the message with one eye and keeping the other warily glanced in the older nin's way, he frowned. It read, "This will be our primary way of speaking. My voice is gone and won't be returning, and hand signs are just too much trouble. Unless my chakra runs low, we should be able to get points across fairly easily and often." A short distance beneath that, and as though it was added as a last-minute thought, "On another note, you have my apologies for the events of yesterday. I may not be the same man you once knew, but I hope we can establish a proper friendship in due time." Naruto looked up from it and tilted his head to the side in imitation of the way Yamato had looked at him with the mask on before. "You don't plan on locking me in a cage and dragging me off to Akatsuki next, do you?" he asked mildly. Yamato frowned and performed a series of hand seals before a piece of wood grew out of his hand and expanded into a long sheet of wood. A few beads of sweat dripped off his forehead as he wrote out his response before handing it to the boy with a blank look on his face. Naruto glanced through it. "Considering that you are a vital member of Konohagakure and liable to save our collective rectums a handful of times in the events to come, as well as the fact that I am no longer bound to honor or obey the orders of Shimura Danzo, you have no need to question my intentions." Going further it continued, "And that aside, you weigh far too much to tote around like a piece of luggage, and I don't even know where the Akatsuki base is if the urge ever arose, though in the years to come I may consider seeking it out if the rest of our days together have such charming conversations and encounters as it's expected to." When Naruto looked up at the older shinobi with a sharp frown, a smirk was etched onto Yamato's face. "Alright, wise guy. Apology accepted," Naruto stated. Yamato began to smile until Naruto smirked in his own way and added, "But only if you buy me a few rounds of ramen." So the boy doesn't have full control over his tailed beast. "It only seems to manifest itself when he'll die without it," Danzo stated as his good eye took in the scroll before him. "That in and of itself will make this process simpler." Folding it away and placing the scroll back onto the table of stone before him, Danzo approached the narrow hole in the outside wall, allowing him to look out upon Sunagakure. "With the One Tails under my grasp, Konoha will gain an impenetrable outer defense," he thought. Any who would enter will have to seep through the walls of sand surrounding it, and when that failure Uchiha Itachi decides to betray us any further, the new formation will stall him if nothing else. Already the route commander was revising and further honing his plans for the years ahead, aiding drastically by the information of what was meant to come. If he had his way, the Jinchuriki would soon find himself raised in a different environment and situation altogether, and when the route was done with him, only one more weapon would be under Danzo's control. Yamato looked on in despair as a 14th empty bowl was stacked up beside the blonde-haired pit before him. Naruto let out a satisfied sigh and leaned back into a stretch, smiling widely. "Thanks Yamato Taicho," he said. Yamato gave him no response as he dug into his pockets for the ryo to cover the outrageous meal. Tucci gave the other man a pitiful look. "Really, sir, how did you not know who you were buying lunch for?" the shop owner questioned rhetorically. Naruto always packs away a hefty amount of noodles. After a moment he turned back to the register, ringing things up. "Anyway, that'll be." The number stated made Yamato's expression sour further as he turned his head to give the endless eating machine a dark look, and with reluctance paid for the family-sized meal. Putting away the ryo, Tucci turned back to them. "Next time I'll give you 10% off, he said with a knowing smirk. Yamato merely grimaced and nodded his head before sliding out of the seat and dragging Naruto with him. The Jinchuriki smiled at the shop owner and waved cheerily as he was hauled off, content and full for the first time since he arrived. A few minutes later they stopped at Naruto's tiny apartment and stepped inside. Naruto immediately sought out a chair and plopped down into it, at ease. Yamato formed another sheet of wood a moment later and pushed it somewhat roughly into the child's hands with a disgruntled noise. "I'm considering retracting that apology. Your response earlier was drastically out of proportion with the meal size." "A few bowls? I counted 14 of them." Naruto shrugged after scanning it. "I'm sure you'll earn the ryo back in a few weeks. Either way, I've already accepted your apology, so you can't take it back," he grinned. Yamato's expression promised retribution in due time. A moody silence lapsed after that as the Junin examined the surroundings and Naruto turned his thoughts toward what to do, now that he more or less had the Hokage's permission and Yamato's assistance if he needed it. Sasuke can handle himself for a little while longer. Gaara's situation is the one that really needs to be worked on before he becomes locked into his homicidal state of mind, Naruto thought. The problem is how to get into Suna without attracting unwanted attention, and I'm pretty sure stopping another daily assault on their Jinchuriki is going to attract a lot of it. "Hey Yamato Taicho," he piped up suddenly. The elder nin scowled, but turned his attention around regardless. "Have you ever been to Sunagakure before?" he asked. The Junin raised his hands after a moment and formed another, if rather smaller, sheet. "No. Why?" it read. Naruto just grinned wider at him. "Well, here's your chance. I have, and I know precisely where to go." Another sour expression crossed Yamato's face as he gave his response. "The Hokage needs to know before you go off to cause an inter-village scandal." Naruto shrugged. "So we go looking like a Tonin or something, and speaking of which, getting a start on Kabuto and Orochimaru's bases would probably be a good idea afterward," he stated calmly. Yamato rolled his eyes heavenward as if in question for what he had done to deserve this, and Naruto caught it and smirked again. "Maybe we'll grab Jiraiya-san along the way so you have some proper backup. Besides, he was supposed to have a network of his own in place, so he should be able to help out fairly easily." Yamato did not grace him with an answer. Kakashi was in the middle of thinking about what he could do for Sasuke when a voice he recognized and in part loathed called to his attention. "My eternal rival. At last I've apprehended you." Looking up from the sheet in his hands, the copycat ninja saw Konoha's noble green beast, as he was calling himself even now, striding forward quickly. "Nope, not this time, friend," he thought as he reached into his pocket and drew out a single kunai. Slinging it out some distance away, Kakashi waited until Guy was nearly on him before trading places with the soaring weapon, and further performing the hand seals for the body flicker technique even before he was fully across. Guy's eyebrows met in determination and he knocked the weapon aside as Kakashi fled. "Aha, you do know something of this innocent tree's fate," he called across the distance, and with that kicked off from the ground to rush after his eternal rival. Kakashi looked over one shoulder to see Guy rushing up from behind and grimaced beneath his mask. Another shunshin later, and to his distaste the other shinobi seemed to have tapped into a whole new degree of determination, arms swinging back and forth rapidly and legs seemingly a blur. His broad grin reflected the sunlight so brightly Kakashi was almost blinded by it. "No time for this right now, Maida," he yelled back and put further distance between them. It was only at that point that he realized with a face palm that the other man had tricked him into one of their fruitless challenges. Performing the hand seals for the shadow clone jutsu, he patted the poor thing on the shoulder and gave it a thumbs up and good luck. Stall him, before pushing it forward and heading off further ahead and out of sight. Guy rushed past the clone shortly thereafter, paying it no attention to chase after his true eternal rival. The clone watched him go for about a minute before sighing and shaking its head. "Nice try, Guy, nice try. You just chased after another clone," it thought, dispelling itself as the real Kakashi broke up through the dirt where he had been and shook the soil loose from his hair. "Maybe next time, eternal rival," he murmured in distaste as he made his way back toward his home. It was as such to his disbelief to find the object of his loathing rounding the corner of Konoha nearest and dashing back into view, and after staring for several useless seconds, he accepted the inevitable for the moment. Hardly out of breath, the other Junin came to a halt a few feet from Kakashi and smiled brightly at him. "An underhanded tactic for sure, but you'll still never dampen my flames of youth, Sharingan Hitaki," Guy stated in a teasing manner. Kakashi bristled at the two terms. "You said something about a tree, Guy. What is it?" he questioned flatly. Maida nodded his head sharply. "Ah yes. Do you possess knowledge over who would dare strike down this visage of beauty in which I pass every morn?" the other Junin asked while gesturing toward the tree Sasuke had used for practice the night before. Kakashi glanced between them. "Why?" he asked suspiciously. "Somehow I doubt this is going to end well," he added silently. Guy gave him a knowing look. "I recognize that shrewdness, Sharingan Hitaki. You know indeed something of this tree's plight. Out with it." Though his look in turn became suspicious, his tone remained light the entire time. Visible eye narrowing, Kakashi answered him at length. "I was teaching an academy student how to tree climb. He's in the hospital recovering." Guy frowned. How badly could a student harm themselves on such a frugal method? He asked in a more serious tone for once. "Determination and poor chakra control for the technique," Kakashi told him simply. After another moment and the same questioning look still leveled at him, Kakashi continued. "I've seen something of his skills before, and the boy is very good when he puts his mind to a task and normally doesn't have much trouble. I just don't think he's ever really tried channeling chakra so far from his core before." The last few words were murmured as he realized something to distract Sasuke from his legs. Guy looked back at the tree and his frown deepened. "This is an unfortunate occurrence. I will see to it the tree returns to its former state if you agree to aid the student back to his own recovery," he asked. Kakashi scoffed. "Of course. I've already taken him on as my apprentice. But even you can't make a tree grow any faster, Guy," he said with a hint of arrogance. Maida's eyebrows rose in surprise. "You, Sharingan Hikate, have taken on an academy apprentice?" he repeated in a tone of voice that made it sound as though Kakashi had just announced he was planning to move a mountain by hand. The other shinobi frowned at him in turn. "Special circumstances have arisen," he stated flatly. "If that's all, Maida, I have things I need to attend to." Turning away and walking back into his small house, Kakashi missed the calculating gleam that entered the other Junin's eyes behind him. "Now I must truly determine another who also bears the flames of youth as myself. My eternal rival's disciple shall have an eternal rival of his own." Sarutobi returned to his office and found Naruto sitting on the desk and snoring lightly. This should be informing, if nothing else. "Naruto," he called to get his attention. The boy didn't stir. Raising an eyebrow, he drew out his pipe and rapped the boy lightly on the shin. It was unfortunate for him that the eyes flicked open in surprise before the body fell into smoke and faded. Sarutobi stared at where the now apparent clone had been in disbelief before raising a hand and rubbing his eyes wearily, and it was only then that he noticed the small and flat section of off-colored wood resting where the clone had been sitting. Picking it up in curiosity, he read the message left behind. "Hokage, Uzumaki Naruto has decided to rescue a future enemy turned friend. Yamato Tenzo." The use of Yamato's former Anbu title was probably a jab at Sarutobi, and one he would sort out later. The immediate problem as he saw it was that Naruto was probably going to stir up trouble, perhaps not intentionally and through no fault of his own, but merely his presence, which seemed to attract it wherever he went. Settling down into his chair, he placed the warning aside and focused on the stack of paperwork for today to distract him from those very unpleasant thoughts. "When should we move against him, sir?" one of the rude Anbu asked. Danzo had given this more than enough thought, and he answered after a moment. "We wait for 2 more days. The next time an assassin prepares to attack, go forward and kill them, and henge into their form once you've disposed of the corpse. Utilize your speed if needed to subdue the Jinchuriki and bring him here," Danzo stated. The other man nodded his head and bowed before turning and waiting for the time to emerge back into the village without notice. "Your will shall be bent to my own, Jinchuriki. Your life shall be forfeit to Konoha's survival and future." Sasuke turned from the window beside him as Kakashi entered that evening and stared at him dully. "It took less time than I expected to prepare something of interest," Kakashi told him. The Uchiha heir barely stirred. Swallowing a grimace, the Junin held up a small and gray if battered book, and looked down on the child. "This book will guide you through flowing chakra out to each section of your body, though I warn you not to try out anything you see upon your legs. If you wish to practice, you will not do so until I am here to ensure nothing goes wrong, and you will only use one of your arms and fingers at a time. Do you accept these terms?" he asked. Sasuke glanced between the object and man twice before giving a small nod of the head and lifting one hand palm up toward it. Kakashi offered it to the child slowly as though doubting the other's sincerity to obey him. Slowly flipping it open, Sasuke looked through the first few pages without a word of thanks. This time he did sigh softly, and sinking down into a nearby chair, Kakashi closed his eye and waited for the last Uchiha to get through at least a few chapters. At the rate his attention is holding it, that should take more or less a couple of hours, he thought dismissively, and resigned himself to whittling away the time in remembrance. It wasn't long before he dozed off, and when he awoke some hours later, a pair of needles attached to clear and nearly empty vials were injected into the boy's abdomen, and one of the Hyuga clan branch members stood nearby observing the process with the Byakugan. "Awake at last, Hikate. Your apprentice, if you truly think such a term is befitting of you after this level of destruction, has sustained far heavier wounds than I would have expected for a child his age," he stated. Kakashi scowled and turned toward him, embarrassed at himself as much as he was anything else. "What are you doing here?" he questioned in a flat tone. The other man laughed just as flatly back at him before answering in a grim tone. The doctor wanted an expert's opinion on the damage to the chakra pathways. Looking down at the other shinobi, he added haughtily, "Your Sharingan didn't deliver half the information needed and couldn't see where it was needed for the chakra injections to be made." Turning away from him and toward where Sasuke was watching them, he continued to verify the injected flow was going as it needed to. Kakashi held his tongue and turned toward the child. Save it for later, he thought. To his surprise, Sasuke looked more alive in the eyes now than he had since arriving in the hospital, and based off of where his finger was resting in the book, he had progressed far further than just the first few chapters. "I'm almost done," he responded to Kakashi's look in a voice of mild pain. The new chakra burned very warmly as it passed throughout his system, and it really was uncomfortable. "Just how long was I asleep?" the Junin asked the Hyuga as he looked out a window to see it had grown dark outside. A grunt of dismissal was his only answer, but at length the Hyuga relented. "Long enough. I entered here an hour ago after Hiyashi-sama decided who to send to answer the doctor's request." Kakashi had nothing more to say at that. No doubt the Hokage would want to know what was going on if he hadn't already heard, and for now his charge was in good, more than good enough care. "I'll be back before long, Uchiha," he said to Sasuke before standing up and departing. About 15 minutes passed without incident and the Hyuga stepped forward to draw out the now empty injection needles. "Relax your stomach and take several deep breaths. On the 4th exhalation I shall draw the first out," he explained. Sasuke nodded without verbally answering and did as he was told. The pain was just as bad going out as it had been going in, but at least it was done with soon enough. Pressing a small cloth to the slightly bleeding wound, the Hyuga told him to repeat the motions and again drew out the second needle and set it aside, then went the extra step to perform the minor healing jutsu required to seal up the cuts. I'll return with another set in 6 hours, child. If you feel your body reacting strangely until that point, alert Hikate and tell him to send for Hyuga-ko. Understand? He told the boy. Sasuke nodded his head silently. Ko's eyes thinned as he gave one last once-over to the pathways before turning the Byakugan off and waiting by the doorway for the Junin to return. Trudging forward through the sands on the way to Sunagakure in an 8-year-old body definitely ranked up there on Naruto's list of things to avoid doing again. At least the last time he had made the trek he was tall enough to avoid getting his eyes, nose, and mouth full of the grainy material. No matter how he adjusted his cloak or hood, it found a way through. If he had just brought those old goggles from before he received his Hite-aid, at least he could have seen properly. Just ahead of him, Yamato was having a much easier time of things with a wooden replica of his former Enbu mask and hood drawn up fully. Blah! Turning to the side to spit yet again, Naruto grimaced as he ducked his head and tried to peer through one hand ahead. Was it always this windy so close to Suna? He thought. I'm definitely taking this trip back on Yamato Taicho's shoulders. His conclusion would probably have earned a light slap upside the head if voiced aloud at their current point in the journey, just 2 days out from Konoha. Glancing around in frustration, he thought he could make out a faint outline far ahead and on their right. Why does everyone hate me? The small red-haired child thought in despair as yet another group of villagers scrambled over themselves to get out of his sight. A single kunai whistled as it cut through the air and neatly sliced through one of his cheeks to draw out a sharp inhalation and gasp of pain. Quickly pressing one hand to the thin line of red, he turned to stare at his next attacker with wide pale blue eyes. It was to his surprise not another assassin but rather an aged villager leaning against a wall for support. Just die already, you damned brat. The old man hissed. Tears welled up within Gaara's eyes as the former shinobi reached down to his belt for another weapon, and for just a brief moment there looked each other eye to eye. For just a moment blue faded to jagged black and yellow points. The old man let out a terrified shout and leaned back away from the killing intent leaking free from the red-haired demon in front of him. Gaara blinked in confusion before panic set in again as the other man sank to his knees, clutching at his heart, alternating between shouts and whispers in his final few seconds. The child took a step back as his head swiveled around to look at the others glaring back at him from windows with hatred and fear. Why? Why? His internal shouts were cut off as an alien feeling drove itself through his heart and stole away his consciousness. No one moved toward the boy or the old man even after 10 minutes had passed, with both laying in the sands. The sight of said sand swirling about their demon container and pressing tightly about his skin only further unnerved them. WH. Where am I? Gaara's voice was faint and weak as he looked up from the ground toward the darkness all around him. A trickle of light far overhead ran down to illuminate the area in a small circle around his form. Dark blue light and jagged yellow slash marks rose up from the shadows outside of that circle surrounding him, and the sheer anger and malice that fell against him from it far outstripped anything he had ever felt from the villagers. You. The tone dripped with the same feeling as before, and a low snarling pressed against his eardrums painfully. Covering up the nearest of them with his hand, Gaara looked around himself for some way to get away from the horrible feeling of looming death. A single tan-toned tail slammed into the ground just beside the circle and made him jump and fall backwards to the very edge behind him. You are the most pitiless creature I have ever laid eyes upon. You continue to subject the both of us to constant threat of death by refusing to show those maggots who is lord of the village. The disappointment in the voice cut into his flesh as sharply as his father's own words. Rise upward and accept my strength. Teach them all the power of the Shukaku. It suddenly whispered to him in a voice so soft and friendly that for a moment Gaara thought a new person or creature or whatever it was had spoken from the darkness. Then it pressed against the light as close as it could, and the tall and swirling sand-coated one-tailed Shukaku entered his full field of vision with its black and yellow eyes both condemning and forgiving him, its dark blue marks shining in their own terrible way. It bared its teeth in a black grin and allowed the brunt of its disappointment and wrath to descend on the human before it. And Gaara could do nothing to tear his eyes free as it pressed harder and harder against the protective field, keeping it out of the light and therefore contained within him. Take me up and destroy them all. It growled, and the child found himself unable to either halt its descent toward him or the tears that flowed from his eyes as memories floated to the surface of his bitter life. A piercing laughter filtered through the air as the Shukaku took its first steps to freedom in a very, very long time by sinking the human's mind into despair. Halt! What purpose do you have in this place? The first guard snapped at the two figures pushing through the worst sandstorm Suna or the outcropping lands around it had suffered since the Shukaku was last active. A tall figure cleared the storm first and approached several more feet into the canyon before sliding his protective facial protector aside and shook loose sand from his cloak and shawl. The strike through Hite 8 declared him to be a defect from Konoha. He turned without answering toward his companion a little ways back, and so did the guard, glancing between them. A slightly shorter blonde woman trudged through in a very battered and torn outfit. Her flowing hair nearly trailed the ground as she pressed against a side of the passage and panted. Two of the active guards' eyes descended and took in the pleasing sight as the third watched the man closely, smelling a deception or trap in the making. The man turned toward them and slowly drew out a broken kunai, which in turn caught their attention again. He gestured with a stabbing motion toward his own throat with wide eyes and then clutching at it as though it were bleeding terribly. Sighing and placing the object back within his cloak, he mouthed something about Konoha's medics saving his life. "What, my partner is telling you? Is that he lost his voice?" The woman panted, leaning on her knees now as though oblivious to the fairly obvious result in her tattered cloths. "HN. So what are you doing here, then?" one of the guardsmen questioned as his eyes rose and fell slowly. She didn't answer. The man with her again slowly reached into his cloak and drew out a wooden tablet. He showed them the carved-out message and both sides to show it had no hidden notes before tossing it lightly forward to their feet. One bent down without taking his eyes away from them despite the enjoyable sight and cautiously read the note. "Seeking refuge and better medical attention before it's too late for my voice box. Konoha's best failed me." The guard read aloud, then looked at the other two. Quote. "Deposit any and all weapons including that kunai where you are. After that we'll see what a search turns up." Giving the blonde another once-over, the one holding the message gestured for the duo to get to it. An exasperated sigh escaped the man as he pulled out another couple of kunai and shuriken before dropping them to the ground. The woman looked up at them blankly. "I lost most of mine in the sandstorm," she said in a sad tone with a pout. You, search him. I'll search the blonde." Dropping the tablet to the ground and approaching with what looked like a pained grimace at trying so hard not to grin. His hands roamed as they pleased for several moments before a truly pained expression crossed his face and the eyes rolled upward. "I will never get tired of using Oiro no Jutsu to great effect." Naruto's voice piped up from where the tablet had been resting on the ground. Emerging from the back of each guard's neck was a shuriken. While not immediately lethal, if they did not receive medial aid soon enough the wounds would kill them in time. Naruto sent out a pair of Oiro clones for each guard to fully subdue them and then follow into Suna after a lengthy period. Watching as the chakra flowed from his fingertips was intriguing. The book mentioned something about attaching it to an inanimate object like a kunai as the basic example and being able to draw it back after thrown or even altering the path by leaving a thin string behind to connect it to his fingers. So far he didn't have anything to attach it to besides his book, but that hardly mattered. He already knew exactly what he wanted to do with the technique in another couple of weeks or so. As the doctor had said, and the Hyuga injecting him with chakra had verified movement would only be detrimental to his legs for at least that time frame. He idly attached it to a page in the book and flipped it over with a slightly awkward twitch of his fingers. Beside him Kakashi observed the process with a nod of the head. "Good job, Sasuke. You're picking this up far faster than I would have expected and certainly with much better control than your tree-walking mastery," the Junin said, catching the child's attention. Looking up at him, Sasuke nodded his head without much emotion showing. He didn't want the older shinobi to guess at what he was intending to do with the technique, but he couldn't underplay his control just yet. It took too much concentration to do that. With another rough flick of his fingertips he sent the next page over and then disconnected the thread from that page. If he keeps that up I may have to find another book for him to read. It's only been 2 days and already his progress is startling. Something more complex but still capable of him once he can move about on his own again might be able to slow him down a little. Kakashi thought as he observed the last Uchiha before him. "Alright, that's enough for today. You can't use too much chakra or the injections won't be truly effective. Keep reading the normal way if you want to, or ask me any questions you might have," he told Sasuke. The boy shrugged noncommittally at him and flicked through another few pages. Both turned, however, at the sound at a series of light rapping against the door frame, and a shiny black bull-headed man stuck his neck in. "Ah, so this is the boy Sharingan Hitaki has chosen as his disciple," Guy murmured softly. Kakashi rose to his feet before the sentence was completed and dragged the other Junin out of the room before trouble could arise from their meeting. He completely missed the small boy standing in Guy's shadow and just beside the door frame. Sasuke was at a better angle to catch sight of him and stared at the long-haired child in something like curiosity when he made no motion to either step forward or leave. At last the other boy took a cautious step forward and gave a slight and swift bow of the head before rising to full height and almost shouting, "I am your eternal rival, Rock Lee," and then rushing after his newly acquired sensei. "What the hell? Eternal rival?" The bewildered expression left on Sasuke's face at the strange encounter would repeat itself in the time to come. Rising unsteadily to his feet, slightly darker eyes looked about Suna as an expression of anger crossed his features. They settled again on the old man who had slit his cheek earlier, and his eyebrows met in further frustration. "They're going to blame me again. I didn't even do anything to hurt him," Gaara thought, turning away and heading back toward his house, for it was most certainly not a home in the loving, tender sense that most children would call one, but rather another place of torment at the efforts of his father and brother. A soft whoosh caught his attention and a swirl of sand erupted from around his feet to capture the empty bottle an inch from the back of his head. Turning slowly toward the attacker, he saw a startled expression before a window was slammed shut and locked up. Grimacing, he shattered the bottle without realizing it and continued again. Gaara had no idea that he was being watched by more than just hateful villagers. Unknowingly, his father's next-sent assassin was laying in wait off ahead with no idea of the capabilities his target could wield, yet the ones who were watching him at present were also silently shadowing his movements in preparation. When the assassin fell toward Gaara with his tanto drawn, he was captured in the hands of two different shinobi and decapitated by the wire trailing between their wrists. The entire ordeal took place 24 feet over the Jinchuriki's head without him realizing it, and by the time the strange coppery scent caught his nose, it was far too late to directly halt the movements against him. That, of course, did not mean that the would-be killer and then shortly discovered partner wouldn't return to their base without first losing a limb or two in the process from the driving sands swirling to life. Ah, Suna, home to more Jinchuriki-hating villagers, homicidal case cage, and a desperate-for-a-friend demon container. Naruto intoned softly as he set foot within the boundary of the village for the first time in this life since coming back. It reminded him fairly sadly of his own childhood, except for the case cage bit. Yamato was less enthused about the whole ordeal. It was decidedly uncomfortable to have had to deal with boys' so-called jutsu to get into the village, even after Naruto explained the plan in fairly good and perverted detail. His most pressing matter was to keep his eyes peeled for any red-haired children in the area, or his ears ready for the screams of pain Naruto forewarned him would probably crop up when the One-Tails decided to make itself known. Whoever this Gaara was, it seemed unlikely that things would go very pleasantly for any of them at that point. Well, now that we're here, the first place we should head to is the case cage's house. Gaara's bound to show up there sooner or later, assassination attempt or no, and it might be possible to at least get his dad to lay off the attacks if nothing else, Naruto declared after looking around the general area. Yamato could feel his blood pressure rising and his previous decision to go along with this whole plan taking a nosedive with the thought of intimidating the case cage into obedience. He formed another sheet of wood and pressed it to Naruto's hands with a slightly maddened look in his eyes. The boy glanced from sheet to face and paled at the dark and frankly spooky expression relayed there. "Do not get Konoha involved in a new war. It's bad enough what you did to get us here," it read. Alright, we'll just scout out for now, I guess." Naruto relented as he took a step back. Yamato kept the look up for another couple of moments in payback before relaxing and smiling wearily at him. Danzo looked upon the host of the one-tailed Shukaku and was surprised by the intensity of his return stare and the state of the root members carrying him in. Without an immediate source of sand, the Jinchuriki would have to dredge it up from the rock around them. The elder shinobi had no intention of allowing that. "Come," He intoned flatly as he gestured, and the panting, blood-soaked duo followed with Gaara trapped between them. Danzo gestured toward a small pool of water in a hollowed-out chunk of the ground. "Deposit him there and leave." They hastened as sand began gathering into the air again. A splash filled the air as Gaara sank up to his nose in water. Sputtering as he struggled to get up above the surface, he locked eyes with the leader of the kidnappers and felt his limbs go limp. His body fell beneath the surface and his head with it this time. Leaning over the small body of water, Danzo ticked off the seconds until at last he reached in and drew the Jinchuriki's head just above. Gasping for breath, Gaara struggled to break free as the man spoke. "If you do not swear on your life to obey my every order and command from this hour forth, I swear in turn to drown your host and kill you, the Shukaku, in the process. Do you hear that, beast? I expect an answer." That's all for now. If you enjoy, then please like, share and do comments.